Welcome to PHP with MySQL Essential Training, Part 2. I'm excited to teach you more about PHP and MySQL because these are fundamental tools of web development. They allow us to create full-featured applications that connect to back-end databases. This course is the second part of a series on PHP and MySQL. In this course, we will build on those skills from the previous course and finish building a content management system using PHP. We'll begin by working on the public-facing pages. We will add a dynamic navigation, which will allow our users to browse different pages of database-driven content. We will learn to write code for multiple contexts, in our case, for the public-facing pages and the staff pages. And we'll create functions which can accept options that modify their behavior for different usage contexts. After building out the public pages, we will add some important features to the staff area. We'll explore how to use cookies and sessions in PHP to store user preferences, frequently used information, or to remember aspects of the application state. We will regulate access to all staff area pages so that users must first log in with a valid username and password before they can view the page, a process known as user authentication. We will discover the benefits of nesting resources, such as our subjects and pages, and examine how nesting impacts the organization of our project code. By the end of the course, the project we build together will be a working content management system with database-driven public pages and a password-protected staff area for managing the site content. This is a beginner course, but it will assume that you already know the basics of PHP as well as the techniques from Part 1. If you need to review your skills, PHP Essential Training and PHP with MySQL Essential Training Part 1 will prepare you with everything that you need to know for this course. Once you're ready, let's get started learning to use PHP with MySQL. This course includes a set of exercise files. In order to make use of those files, you'll want to first make sure that you have PHP and MySQL installed and working. The exercise files are arranged by chapter and by movie. And you can find the exercise files that correspond to the movie that you're watching by first looking for the chapter number and then the movie number. You should copy the exercise files into your web document root directory. That's a location where your web server will look for files whenever a browser requests them. On my Mac, that's going to be inside my user directory, inside the sites directory. It's always a good idea to make a copy of the exercise files so that you still have the original to refer back to if you make changes. I will option drag the folder to create a new copy. Our project will also need a database for the exercise files to work correctly, and your database needs to match what the files expect. In the exercise files, you will also find a database file that ends in .sql. You can load into MySQL to put your database into the same state as mine. If you don't already have a database, the first few movies of Chapter 1 will get you started. You can then load that file directly into a MySQL database, either by using a tool such as phpMyAdmin or by going to a command line application and typing MySQL space -u followed by a username that's authorized to access the database, followed by the -p option, and then the database name, which is globe_bank, followed by a less than sign, and then the path to get to that database file. If you're on a Mac, you may be able to just drag that file into the window in order to get the full path. Once I hit return, it will prompt me for my password. And this will be the password that matches the username. Note that the import will remove all old database data at the same time as it imports new data. Importing can also be useful if you do a lot of experimenting on your own, but then you want to get your data back in sync with mine. Once you have the same files and the same database, you will be able to follow along with me. Everything that's in the exercise files we will create together during the tutorials. So you can just work along with me and your files will mirror what's in the exercise files. Remember that you can pause the video or rewind if you need more time to copy something down. You can also use the exercise files to check your work or to get back in sync if you experiment on your own. We will begin our PHP work by blueprinting the web application that we intend to build throughout this course. This will provide us with a good overview of the work that lies ahead. The web application we're going to be building is a content management system, or CMS for short. The idea is to have web pages which administrators can use to create and edit content, but the public has different pages where they can read the content, but which are not editable. An essential first step when starting any web project is to create a project blueprint. If the site's simple, you may be able just to type up a few notes or draw a picture. But if the site's complex, you may need page mockups and even flowcharts. The fundamental idea is that in either case, to take what's in your head and put it on paper so that you can look it over and assess the work before you start. It helps you to clarify it and to force you to think about problems that you might otherwise have put off until you were down the road with your development. I usually do my blueprinting by getting out a pen and a piece of paper and then drawing boxes to represent the different parts and pages of the site. I draw connections between the boxes and I make lists inside the boxes. By the end, I have a full picture in front of me and I don't have to hold all the moving parts in my head anymore. Instead, I can use that part of my brain for development. And then I don't have to try and build the whole site all at once. I can tackle it piece by piece. I can even tack my blueprint up on the wall in front of me and refer to it as I develop. It's efficient and it's liberating. So that's what we're going to do. So let's start with our blueprint. The website we're going to build is going to have two areas, the public area and the admin or staff area. The public area is going to have the part that the public sees. It's going to have a navigation to allow them to move around between the different pieces of content. And then it's going to actually display content for them for the different pages that they've selected. So if they want to see the history of the company, they'll click on the history link and they'll see page content about the history. And that's all going to be read only. They're only going to be able to view that content. Now on the other side, we have the admin area. The admin area is going to be password protected. So we're going to need a login form. We're going to need to have a username and a password to get in. And then once we're in there, we'll be able to manage the different pieces of content. We'll be able to manage the subject and pages content, manage which admins are allowed into the staff area, and then we'll also be able, of course, to log out as well. This course is part 2 of a 2-part series. In the previous course, we built the basic admin area to interact with the database and to create new records, read existing records, edit records, and delete records. You'll remember that we use the acronym CRUD for these 4 basic operations: create, read, update, and delete. So we learned how to do that, and we already have the CRUD for the subjects and the pages already built as a result of that work we did in part 1. In this course, we're going to build the public area, the CRUD that allows us to manage the admin users, and then the user authentication piece that will allow us to log in with a password, to log out, and also to make sure that only logged in users can see the different pages inside the admin area. In case you're still having trouble visualizing the CMS that I've described, let me show you a quick demo of the finished project that we'll be creating. So here we are on the public side. This is what the public is going to see. You can see that we have the logo for the company up here, and we have the homepage content they're going to see here. Over here, we have a navigation. Let's just choose between different items. I'm going to choose About Globe Bank, and you'll see that it switches us to a new page of content, page that has About Globe Bank, and it has all sorts of information here. In addition, I can click on History, and it'll change to a different page, right? So I can switch between the different content that's in each one of these. And you can see that this opened up to reveal the pages that were below each subject as I did that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the admin area. You see I've got a login page. I provide a username and password, which I've already typed in. I'll click Submit, and you can see that it then takes me into the staff area and lets me manage the page content or the admins. We're also going to be creating the CRUD for the admins. You can see here I have this user. That's how I logged in, is John Doe. And that will allow me then to review records about John Doe, to edit those, to make changes, everything like that. Be able to decide who gets into this admin area. And we can log out. And of course, if we try to go back to those pages, let's just click the back button here and let's go to Edit Admin. You'll see that it doesn't let me in. It just sends me to the login page, right? It doesn't matter if I go to, let's change this, actually type it into admins edit.php. You'll see I get redirected to login. It doesn't give me access to that page unless I'm logged in. So that gives us a blueprint and a peek at the kind of site that we're going to be developing throughout this course. In the next movie, let's get started building it. Because this course builds on the work that we already did in part 1, we need to make sure that we get our database and our database tables in order before we begin. If you're coming to this course directly from part 1, then you should have everything already in order. But it's a good idea still to just make sure. First thing we need to do is make sure that we have a database already created. And we do that with the create database command and then the name of the database we want. In this case, globe_bank. Then we want to have a user who has access to that database. By default, there's a root user in MySQL who has access to all the databases, but that root user has a lot of privileges, and we really would rather not use that user with our web application. So it's a good practice to create a new user. Here I'm creating one called web user. So you can see the command is grant all privileges on Globe Bank, and then a period and an asterisk to indicate that it's a wildcard for all tables on the Globe Bank database. And then to, and then the name of the user, which here is just web user, and where they're connecting from. So web user at localhost in this case. Localhost could be an IP address or something if the computer were located somewhere else, but because my database and my web application exist on the same computer, localhost ensures that only someone can connect locally. And then the password, identified by, and then whatever password you want to use. I'm just using a very insecure password, secret password. You should choose something better for yourself. Once we have the database created and we have the user assigned, now from the command line, we can interact with MySQL in order to import the data from the end of part 1. So MySQL-U web user, that'll tell it which user to use, -P will say that I want to provide a password, and then I'm going to target the Globe Bank database. Then you can see I've got a less than sign followed by the path to the SQL file that I want to import. That basically says read this file and send it into MySQL, send it into the Globe Bank database, and that'll make sure it creates all the tables and the data that we need to be in sync. Let's walk through it together. So to interact with MySQL from the command line, I need to open up a command line application. On Windows, that's Command Prompt. On a Mac, that's Terminal. So here I am inside Terminal, and I'm just going to type MySQL-U, and I'm going to use my root user to start with, -P. Now my root user has a password. I'll type that in. And now I'm logged into MySQL as the root user, and I can say show databases. And you'll see that there's just a few basic databases that are there by default in MySQL. It does not have our database that we want. Now, if you took part 1, you probably already have the database and you don't need to do this next step. So I'll create the database, globe_bank with a semicolon at the end. And now the database is there. Show databases. You can see that it does exist now. Now we want to make sure that we have that user created. So grant all privileges on Globe Bank with a dot and an asterisk to the name of our user, which is going to be web user at, and then localhost, identified by secret password. Again, you should pick a password that's better than that. So now I have my database and I have a user that has access to that database. So I'm going to quit out of MySQL to be back at the command line again. And this time I'm going to go back to MySQL, but this time I'm going to do it as that new user, web user, with the password that I just created. That's going to be the -P option. I'm going to target the Globe Bank database because it now exists. I'll use the less than, and then I need to provide the path to the SQL file that we want to import. Now you can put the file someplace that you recognize, and then you can type in the path to it. You may be able to also just drag the file into your terminal application and have it do a quick shortcut for you for the location of that file. It's going to be different for everyone. So wherever you've got the file located, if it's in your exercise files or if you've moved it to your C drive or to your desktop, locate it there and type in the full path to get to that file. Once you do that, you hit return. It'll ask for your password. And now it's performed the import. We can confirm that it worked by typing again MySQL-U web user -P Globe Bank. And this will just put us into MySQL already using the Globe Bank database. Type my password. And now if I say show tables, you'll see that we have both subjects and pages. We can inspect each one of these with show fields from subjects. And we can see the structure of the database. We can see what the different columns are, what the types are for each of those columns. And then we can also take a look at what's inside each one. Select all, that's what the asterisk means, from subjects, semicolon at the end, and we can see the data that's in there already. So you can see I've got 4 different records in my subjects table. They have ID numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5. And you can see that they have positions and they're marked visible, etc. Let's take a look at the pages table. Show fields from pages. You can see what that looks like. And then let's select all from pages to see some of the data that's in there. So you get an idea of what's there. The content you can see is blank. We're going to be coming back and working with that content a little later, but for now it's blank. Now if you have something in there, that's fine too. The most important thing is just to make sure that you have a good starting set of data for the subjects and the pages. There's one more thing that I want to draw your attention to, which is that one of the columns in the pages table is subject_ID. If you'll recall from part 1, that was an important aspect of how we make relational databases work, because we have one subject that has many different pages underneath it, and that's a one-to-many relationship. And the way that we make those one-to-many relationships is by having that subject_ID. It's called a foreign key, and it allows us to match up the foreign key of each page with the primary key of each subject. And that's how we know which page belongs to which subject. So that gives you a quick overview of some of the work that we did in part 1 and also gets everything in place. And at the end, we can just quit out of MySQL because we're actually going to be using PHP to access the database throughout most of this course. In the previous movie, we got our database all set up. Now we also need to get our project file set up. We're going to start with a quick review to make sure that you have the same files as the end of part 1 of this course. But even if you recently completed part 1, you should still follow along because I am going to be adding some new files as well. The first thing you should do is identify a location where your web server on your local computer can access these files. For me, that's my sites directory. That's my web document root, and so I'm going to put my project into there. If you completed part 1, your project is probably already in there. And then I'm going to take that and open it up inside the Atom text editor. It'll open up in project view so that I can browse the files that are inside the project. If you recall, we divided our work into 2 different folders, the public folder and the private folder. And the idea was that when we actually launch this on a production server for the world to see, we're going to tell our web server to target the public directory as the web document root. That means that the public will only be able to access things that are in the public directory. But anything in the public directory, we have to assume they have access to. That's not true for the private directory though. They won't have access to what's in the private directory. However, our code in the public directory will, because it can still navigate the file system in order to find those files and load them in. So our private directory is where we're going to put our library of functions and things like that we're going to be using. We aren't going to go through all of those and review all the work we did before, but I do want to just call your attention to initialize.php. You remember this was the special file that gets things kicked off for us. You can see here it turns on output buffering, it sets some different constants that we're going to be using, and then it loads in the different functions and the database connectivity, things like that we're going to need. And at the end, it even goes ahead and creates that database connection for us so that we're ready to go. We have a database connection that we can work with. So all we have to do is load up this initialize.php file. So one of the new files that I've added here, one of the changes I've made since the end of part 1 is that index.php has been changed. It used to just be some placeholder text. Now it has some basic structure to it. You'll notice at the beginning, I'm calling require once and I'm targeting initialize.php. So that's going to load up all of those functions and database connectivity for us. Then I'm using the shared path constant that we created in part 1 in order to locate some new files, public header and public footer. And then between, I've just got some basic HTML here that we're going to use to structure our page. Let's take a look at public header and public footer. Public header.php is in the shared directory. And you can see that it's just got some HTML5 basic template here. It's going to output the page title if we've got one. And you'll notice that it's using the function we wrote in part 1, URL4, in order to create an absolute path to locate that content. Instead of a relative path, it's an absolute path. That was a helper we created that's been very useful. We also use it down here when we're creating a path to index.php. That's going to be a link around an image tag that's going to display the Globe Bank logo. You can see that I've added the GBI logo.png file here to the images directory as well. And then there's the footer, public_footer, which just has some basic copyright information. It also has a disclaimer about this being a fictitious company. And if we had a database connection, it will disconnect it at the end. So now let's take a look at that CSS file. Down here in style sheets, before we had staff.css, now I also have public.css. You can see that this just defines some basic structure for what the page ought to look like. And then as we go a little bit further down, we have some styles for the navigation. And a little bit further down, we have styles for our page content for different parts of the page. Some of the pages have some special features like the disclaimer. There's some things called service blocks, learn more, links, etc. Now, you don't have to pause the movie and copy all those down. Those are provided in the exercise files. So you can go and grab that file from the exercise files if you don't have it already and just drop it into your style sheets. And the same thing is true for index.php, for the logo PNG file, and for public header and public footer. Those are all in the exercise files, and those are the 5 files that have changed since the end of part 1. But what that does is it puts us in a good place to get started with our project, because then we can go into a browser. You can see I already navigated to localhost. And then for me, I use tilde and then my username, Kevin Skoglund, and then GlobeBank for the project and public. Then that locates that index.php file. So now we can load up the page and see what it looks like. And you see it's got the logo up here at the top. And then we have a place here for our navigation and a place over here that's going to hold our page content. So take a few minutes to get your project files in order. Go into the exercise files if you need to grab out those new files, add them to your project, bring it up in a browser, make sure it all looks good, and we'll be ready to start developing new features together. In this chapter, we will learn to build the navigation that the public is going to use to change the page of content that they're viewing. We'll begin by creating a list of the current subjects in the navigation. This is going to apply the skills that we learned in part 1 of this course, and it also gives us an opportunity to do a quick review of how PHP interacts with the database. If you'll remember, there are 5 basic steps to PHP database interaction. The first is we need to create a connection to the database. After we have a connection, we can perform a database query, we can use the data returned by that query, if any, and then finally release the returned data when we're done with it. That frees up memory. And then when we're done with all of it, we can close the database connection at the end. Steps 1 and 5 are performed only once per PHP script. Steps 2, 3, and 4 can be performed one or multiple times. Let's look at it in PHP code. Here you can see I'm using the MySQL connect function and passing it in the server name, the username and password to access MySQL, and then the database name I want to use. I'm going to assign that handle to the variable DB, and from then on, whenever I want to talk to the MySQL database, I can use that open connection that's assigned to the variable DB. I compose the SQL that I want, and I assign that to the variable SQL, and then I call MySQL query, pass in the database connection handle, and my SQL that I want to send to it, and I get back a result, and I assign that to subject set. Now this is a MySQL set of results. In order to extract results from that set, I have to use MySQL fetch a sock. And what that does is it returns an associative array that I can work with for each one. You'll remember that we used a while loop as a very clever way to pull each of those records out of the subject set until they go away. So every time it grabs another row from that result set and assigns it to subject as an associative array, and using this type of while loop is a common way to iterate through the records in a result set. Then I can work with those results. Here I'm just simply echoing back as the menu name. And then when I'm done working with those results, I can free up the result using MySQL free result, and then finally close the database connection. We're going to be doing this inside index.php. So let's open up that page, and you'll see that the first thing it does is it calls initialize.php. If we look at initialize.php, you'll see that it calls a function down here at the bottom called dbconnect, and that was a function that we put here in our database.php file, and dbconnect calls MySQL connect with all of those constants for the server, the username, the password, and everything that we stored in our database credentials file. So dbconnect basically creates the connection. We've got some error checking in there to make sure the connection exists, but in the end it returns that connection handle, and you can see that in initialize, we're assigning that to the variable db. So that's what we're using. So what that means is that when index.php requires initialize.php, it is also opening that database connection. That's step 1 for us. Now, step 2, 3, and 4 is where we're going to actually make our query and get back the results. We'll do that in a moment. I just want to show you that in the public footer, we already have code that does the closing. db_disconnect, again, that's another function that we wrote here, and it just checks to see if the connection is set, then close it. So now that we know that our page has the opening and closing of the database connection, now we can just use that database connection assigned to the variable DB. Now what we want to do is we want to put our navigation right here before the page. Now we could put it directly on this page. Another option would be to take all this code and put it into a function that we call. Or what I think is a better option, and what we're going to do here, is let's actually include the file as a separate file, just like we did up here. In fact, I'm going to copy this line for the public header, but instead of public header, let's make it public navigation. All right, so it's going to be all the code we need is going to be in this public navigation file inside our shared path, which is this shared folder. Now, I've already created that file over here, and it's going to be in the exercise files if you want to grab it as well. And I'm just going to drop that into the shared folder, and then we'll take a look at it together. Let's go here and let's look at public_navigation.php, and you'll see that it already has the code that we need to work with all of these subjects. It's calling find all subjects. That was a query function that we wrote previously. Find all subjects uses that DB connection, creates the SQL like we just saw in the slide example. It calls MySQL query on it. It gets a result. It makes sure that it got a result and returns an error if it didn't, and returns that back to us. So what we get here in the public navigation is a result set. Now I'm assigning that to a variable called nav_subjects. I'm not assigning it to just something like subjects. I want to make sure this is separate, so I'm putting nav in front of it, just so that if I use subjects somewhere else as a list of subjects, it doesn't interfere. This is separated and sort of namespaced for the navigation. So I've got my nav subjects. I'm using my while loop to go through each one of those and assign each one to nav subject. And I'm doing all of that inside a UL tag for an unordered list. Each list item in there is going to be a link, and that link is just going to be a URL for this same page. We'll come back and work on this later. I'm using URL 4 there. And then you can see that I'm outputting the menu name. That is the key in the associative array that's going to return back the menu name for this particular subject. You may remember that in part 1 of this course, we defined this H function as a shortcut for calling HTML special characters, HTML special chars. That's all it is. It's a shortcut for that, and it allows us to escape any special characters that might be in that menu name and prevents cross-site scripting. It prevents characters that might break our HTML and cause bad effects. So it's just going to output that subject name inside a link, and then we're going to close up all those tags. Notice here that I have a comment, a PHP comment. I like to do this at the end of my loops just to remind me that this closing brace here matches this code up here. It makes it a little easier than trying to have to look up to figure out what was going on up above. I know where the end of my loop is. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to call MySQL free result on it. So now we've done all 5 steps of the database interaction. We opened our connection. We did our query here inside this function. We looped through and used the results of that query, and then we freed the result, and at the very end, we closed our database connection. Let's try it in a browser. Here I am on my main page. I'll hit return, but you can see that I now have a list of my subjects sorted by their position. In the previous movie, we were able to create a list of subjects to display in the navigation that users will use to navigate the page content of the public-facing website. In this movie, we will learn to add a list of each subject's pages underneath those subject names. What I mean is that underneath About GlobeBank, there should be a series of pages of content that are related to this subject. About GlobeBank is the subject. It's not the page. It doesn't have any content on its own. There are a series of pages related to it that do, and those should show up right below it. And then for consumer, there should be a list of pages that show up under consumer, and so on. If you recall, in the first part of this course, we talked about the fact that there is a one-to-many relationship between a subject and its pages. One subject has many pages. And the way that we represent this in a relational database is we use a foreign key that's in the pages table, and that's what relates them together. So a subject with an ID of 3 as its primary key is related to pages which have a subject ID of 3. That's their foreign key. And that's how we're able to tell the two. If we have a subject and we want to find out its pages, we can look at the primary key of 3, and we can query the database table on pages to find all pages that have that same subject ID. Or we can do the reverse. If we have a page and we want to know what subject it belongs to, we can look at its subject ID and then query the subjects table and ask it for subjects where the ID is equal to 3. So what we want to do inside our menu is inside the loop, while we're looping through the different subjects, inside this LI tag, right, for each list item, after we've got the A tag, we want to then go and get a list of the pages, and we want to display the list of pages that are there. we don't have a function that will allow us to do that. Like we had find all subjects here. In our query functions, you'll see for pages, we had find all pages, but that's not what we want. We only want pages that belong to the subject. We also have find page by ID, but that finds a page based on its primary key, its ID, and we want to use subject ID. However, find page by ID is going to be a good one for us to use as a starting point. So I'm just going to take that code and copy it, and I'm going to jump down to the bottom of the file and paste it in again, and I'm going to call this find pages, it's plural, because we're finding more than one, by subject ID. And the variable we'll pass in will be subject ID. All right, so let's set about modifying this so that it would work. The SQL we want is we want to find all from the pages table where the subject ID is equal to the subject ID. Now, one advantage of reusing this code is that we already have this DB escape in there. You may remember that this was a function that we created in part 1. It's inside database.php, and you'll see down here we have DB escape, which calls MySQL real escape string and protects us against SQL injection. That's the purpose of that, to make sure that we escape any values that might be sent in dynamically. So we always want to have that, and remember, we also always want to surround it with single quotes, which we've got here. Now, we're going to be getting back more than one, so let's also add a space to the end of this, and then let's add another line here that says how we want to order those records. We want to order them by their position, ascending. And that'll just make sure that we get them back in the right order. Okay, so now we've got that SQL. Make sure you've got the space here at the end so that it does concatenate correctly. And we do end up with a space before the O in order. Then we're going to perform the query and get back a result. We want to confirm the result set. That's fine. Notice before, though, we were going ahead and fetching the associative array out of that because there was only one page. Here, we're going to take those two lines out because we're not going to be returning the associative array. Instead, we're going to be returning the entire result, the result set. So this is going to return a result set where this returned just an associative array. All right, so now that we've got that written, I'm going to just copy this. Let's save that file. Let's switch back to our public navigation, and we want to use it. Now, actually, in order to use it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this code here, the loop that we had before, all the way down to even freeing the result. I'm going to take all of that and copy it. And I'm just going to paste it right in here. There we go. Now, instead of nav subjects, though, we're now going to be finding nav pages. And the function we're going to be using is this one, find pages by subject ID. Find pages by subject ID. And the value we're going to pass in is nav subject. And it's going to be the just ID of that subject. So we'll pass in the subject's ID. We'll get back a list of pages. This UL is going to be pages, and then we'll change this to be page. We'll change this to also be pages, so it'll loop through each of the pages, just like we did for the subjects. The process is the same, but it's going to be nav page. It also is called menu name. We also want to use the H to escape it before we output it. We'll go ahead and put it inside an LI tag inside a link, just like we did before. But then it's while nav pages. And of course, when we free the result, we want to free up pages. We're at the end of the loop of pages. Take a second if you need to make sure you understand what we did there. Basically, we're just doing another loop through the pages inside our subject loop. If that's not clear in the code, it might be clearer once I save it and bring it up in the browser. Let's try it out. Let's come over here. Let's reload our page and look at that. It's looping through our list of subjects, but as it gets to each subject, it also pauses and does another loop through the pages by using the primary key of the subject, the ID, in order to find the foreign key of the pages. And then it goes through and lists those in exactly the same way. Now we have a list of our subjects and the pages of content, which is really what we want for the user to be able to browse the different parts of the site. We want to be able to click on those different pages of content. We've got the start of a good navigation going. Now our navigation has a list of the pages of content grouped by their subject. Clicking on any of those page links doesn't actually bring up any content yet, but we'll get to that soon. We're almost ready to allow the user to select page content from the navigation and then display it. But in order to display that content, we have to make sure that we have content. So in this movie, we're going to make sure that we have page content in our database available to display. We're also going to add some homepage content. Let's start there. There are a few files that are included in the exercise files that we're going to be using here. The first is static homepage.php. I'm going to grab that page and just drag it into the shared directory. Inside private, shared, I'm going to add static homepage.php. Now in the public directory, I'm going to need to add some images. One of those is going to be homepage assets, and the other one is going to be page assets. I'm going to take both of those and drag those into there as well. Homepage assets has the images that we need to show the homepage. They're used by that static homepage.php. And I'm keeping them separate from the page assets, which are the images that are going to be used by the database. The difference will become clearer as we keep going. What I want to do now is let's switch into our project view and let's take a look at index.php. Now what I want to do here is inside this page, when no page is selected at all, I want to display the homepage. And what I want to do is display that static homepage that we just added to our shared directory. Let's take a quick look at that file. Static homepage.php, you can see up here, it's got a hero image at the top, it's got a div with ID content, and then it's got some HTML down here showing a couple of other images with a bit of text around them all the way down the page. All right, something very simple. So let's switch back to index.php. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to just take this include line we had before, and I'm going to paste it right in here. And let's just break this up a little bit. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want to add a note right above it. Now, we're going to show the home page. There are a couple of different ways that we can handle the home page when we're working with the content management system. The first is that it could be static content that's just right here inside index.php. So if no page has been selected, here's your default page, right? And that's what we're doing here. We're putting it in a separate file. Let me change the name of this. Instead of public navigation, it's going to be static homepage. So it's going to be in this static file, or it could just be static text in here, but it's not dynamic. It's not database driven. The second option is that it could be in the database, and we could just display the first page that's in our navigation. Whatever that first page of content is, that's the home page. A third choice is that it could be in the database, but not in the navigation. We would have to add code that would make sure that it's excluded from the navigation, so it doesn't show up there, but we could still find it from the database here, pull it up and show it. That's a more complicated solution. Now, in the real world, from my experience with my clients, I find it's about half and half, whether it's static content or database-driven content. And the reason why is because a lot of times what gets displayed on the home page is fundamentally different from the rest of the site. It might be a slideshow, it might be just some opening static content, just describing basics about the company, something that doesn't change necessarily very often, or it could be pulling in lots of other parts from other parts of the database and assembling those together, right? So that it's not any one single database-driven page, it's made up of lots of different parts. So there are a number of different strategies for how we can do that. Here we're just going to have a static home page. If someone picks a page of content, then we'll show something different. So let's just look at this to see what this looks like to start with. Let's go over here, and you can see we get this static page of content, and we're getting those images out of that images directory just like that. It's got some placeholder. These are just fake links. They don't actually go anywhere, but you get the idea. This is the homepage content. So anytime you click on the logo, it'll take you back to the homepage. Now what we want is when we click on one of these entries here, we'll go to a dynamic database-driven page. We're going to work on actually making that functionality work in the next movie. For now, I want us to start by just making sure that we have that content. So if we go into our staff area, again, that's in public/staff index.php, you can see that we have our old CRUD that we created in the last course, and we have one for pages. And I have a list of all my pages here. What we want to do is make sure that each one of these pages has content for it. So if we go back to list, we click on edit. Here, what we want to do is add in the content for each and every one of those. Now you can do that yourself. I've also got inside the page content folder, I've provided snippets for what should go in each and every one of those. Or the shortcut here is just to import the file, just to open up terminal and use MySQL user web user -p and then globe bank, and then import from the exercise files the file that you want. Just drag it in here. That'll import it. Once you provide the password, it'll replace what you have now for your pages and your subjects, and yours will be exactly like mine. That can save you going through and having to add it to each one of these. So it's up to you which way you'd rather do it. You can do it manually, or you can do the import. Once you do that, you should have content for each and every one of these pages. And then in the next movie, we'll be ready to switch back to our public area. And when we click on one of these links, we'll be able to go and find that content from the database and display it here in place of the default content that we have for our homepage. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that we are using images here, and we're using them both on our homepage, and we're also going to be using them inside the page content for each one of these. If we take a look, you can see here it's using images from that page assets directory that we just drug into our project, right? That's here inside images, inside page assets. Now, it is possible to have a feature that would allow you to upload images inside the content management system, but that's a little bit more advanced than what we're ready for here. That's actually a topic that I cover in the PHP Beyond the Basics course. How do you upload different files to the server? There are a lot of considerations we have to take there. So right now, we're just going to have the user upload the files into the page assets directory, and then they would go into the staff area and add the reference to that image inside the dynamic content. Now that we added page content in the last movie, we have our database data ready, and we're ready to let the user choose different pages of content using our navigation. You should already have the skills to accomplish this from what we did in part 1 of this course. That is, you want to be able to click on one of these links and have it send a URL parameter that'll indicate which page we're working with. That'll then show up here in the URL, and then we'll be able to grab that parameter, go to the database, and find the appropriate page to display it here. Let's walk through it together. Let's go to our code. We want to go into the public navigation, and right here where we're outputting the nav page menu name, right above it we have a link, and that link right now just goes to index.php. It also needs to send a URL parameter. So we're going to call it ID. So ID is going to be equal to the dynamic value from nav page, and it's just going to be ID. Now, we don't want to just use that value on its own. We know better than that. We know that we need to URL encode that, and we made a shortcut function for that, just called U. That'll make sure that the value is safe to put into a URL. And we also know that we want to use H around it as well, because we want to HTML escape it using HTML special chars to make sure that it's safe to output in our HTML. So now we know this page ID is safe, both for the URL and our HTML. All right, let's try it out. Let's save that. Let's go back and let's reload the page. And when we roll over Globe Bank, you'll see it says page ID equals 1. I roll over history, it says page ID equals 2. Click on it, you can see it shows up here. Now, it didn't change the page content, but we are sending the value in the parameter. So now what we need to do is actually read that value in, and that's going to be on index.php. Right here after we initialize, but before we show the header, let's add a bit of PHP code. And this code is going to say if is set, and we're going to use the super global get ID. If that value is set, then let's set the variable page ID equal to that value. I'll just copy and paste it. And so then we'll know that something's being sent, right? So then we need to find the page. So how can we find the page using this page ID? Well, we already have a query function for that. If we remember and look back over here, scroll down a bit, we get to our pages. Here's one, find page by ID. You pass it in an ID and it returns a page record to you. That's perfect for what we're looking for. So I'm going to copy that, come back over here, find page by ID using page ID, and then assuming that it worked, we'll get back a page. Now, if we didn't get a page, we'll want to handle that error. So let's do if for some reason there was not a page returned to us, then what do we want to do? Let's redirect to, that was one of our helper methods that allows us to redirect to URL for, let's just go to index.php. So if we did get a page ID that doesn't work for some reason, it's not in the database, then let's just go back to the home page. Otherwise, we'll have a page that we can work with and display. Now, if for some reason it's not set, then we don't need to do anything. We can say nothing selected, show the home page. All right, let's scroll down here. Now, we're already showing the home page all the time. We don't want to do that all the time. Instead, let's check and see if is set page, right? If we found a page, then we want to show that page. Else, we're going to show the home page. I'll just take all of this and move it up inside that else statement. So if it's set page, then show the page from the database. And the way we'll do that is echo. We already have all the information we need inside this associative array. It's just called content. So there we go. Let's try it out. Let's save it. Let's come back over here. Let's reload our page. I'm just going to reload the one that says ID equals 2. And look at that. We got the history. GlobeBank. We get about GlobeBank. Now, wait a minute. We're seeing HTML here. We're not seeing something that's nice and friendly. That's because we're calling HTML escape on it, which is a good idea. We want to escape dynamic content. We need to. Unfortunately, right now, it's breaking things. And we're going to learn how to deal with this later. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to put in a big to-do here. This is very common for developers to do. You type to-do with no spaces in all caps, and then you say add HTML escaping back in. And then I'm going to take it away for right now, just so that it looks right. So we're making ourselves a little bit vulnerable for the moment. We're going to come back and fix that later. For now, let's hit return, and you'll see that it works correctly, right? GlobeBank, leadership, history, right? I'm getting all of my content and it looks correct. We're going to make a mental note that we have to come back and deal with that HTML escaping later. We're actually going to tackle that in the next chapter. For now, let's keep working on the navigation and solve another problem that's come up, which is that we don't actually have any indication over here which one of the current pages is being displayed. We're not marking the one that's currently selected. In the previous movie, we learned to show page content as the user makes choices in the navigation. But we realized that there's a problem with it, which is that there's no indication for which page is currently selected in the navigation. And we're going to fix that in this movie by learning to highlight the current page. So what we want to do is have it so that when we click on GlobeBank, that there's some indication that GlobeBank has been selected. And we click on history, we want an indication that history has been selected. Sure, it says it here, but there's no indication in the navigation. And that's what we want to add. So the first thing I want to show you is that there is a style that's already in the style sheet to help us with this. In public.css, if we scroll down here till we get to the part on the navigation, you'll see that there's a style here that says whenever there's a class of selected, then the A tag, the link that's inside of it, should have a different color. Right? That's all it is. It says anytime there's that, then any A tag that's inside of it will be a different color. So all we have to do is have this class added to our HTML, and then it will indicate which one has been selected. Now, I think this approach, adding a class when something is selected, is a better approach than actually going into here and having different content, actually having some different HTML that we would replace instead of this. So you have a big if-else statement or something, put this in here if it's is or if it's not, right? I think having a class is better because we're really just dealing with the presentation of the data, right? The data is the same in both cases. It's just the presentation that we want to change. So what we want to have here is something that just says class equals selected, right? Let's take a look at that. Just put that class in there. Let's go into Firefox. Let's reload our page. Now you see what happens when they're all selected, right? It just turns it orange. We don't want them all to be selected. We want this to be conditional. Let's write some PHP that'll do that for us. So we want to say if nav page ID is equal to, and what we want to check it against is page ID. If you'll remember, page ID is being set over here by index.php, right? Page ID is set to whatever is being sent in the URL. So we can use that here inside our navigation. And that's because this gets set, and then down here is where we include the navigation. So that variable is still accessible to us. So we want to check and see. And if those are equal, then we're going to put a line that says echo and let's put in selected. That's it. Let's go back and take a look. Let's reload our page and look at that. Now history is selected. Click on GlobeBank. Now GlobeBank is selected. Leadership and so on, right? Now it knows which one is selected because it's comparing this ID against the page ID as it's looping through each one of these. Let's click and just go back to the home page for a second. Uh-oh, wait a minute, what happened? We got an undefined variable here, right? When we go to the home page, there is no ID. So we also need to allow for the possibility that there might not be anything sent at all. We need a default value here. So let's just add a bit of PHP up here at the top of our navigation. And we're going to say page ID is equal to whatever page ID is or default to an empty string, right? I'm using this syntax. This is PHP 7 syntax, this question mark, to set it to a default value. I'll just make a note here, default values to prevent errors. All right, let's go back and let's just reload our page. And look at that. Now we get all of them. None of them are selected, but we didn't get an error anymore. So that default value fixed it for us. Now, it'd be nice if when we click on Globe Bank, that it also indicated which subject was selected as well. The subject would work the same way. If it has that class of selected on it, then its link would also turn to this orange color. So let's do that to it as well. So we know that we need to do the same kind of thing up here inside this LI tag, and we can actually just take all of this. Let's copy it. We'll paste it in. So this time instead of nav page though, it's going to be if nav subject ID is equal to subject ID. Now we don't have this variable yet. We're going to have to go and set that. So let's first make sure we know we're going to need a default for it. So let's give ourselves one of those. Subject ID is equal to subject ID. And let's go over here to index.php. And right here, after we find the page, if there's not a page, we redirect. But if there is a page, then we know we can set subject ID equal to that value, to its foreign key, page, and then subject ID. Okay, so now we have subject ID set, and in our navigation, we're using that to determine whether or not this one should be marked selected as well. Let's go back and look at that. About Globe Bank is selected, still selected, history. When I click down here on consumer banking, now consumer is selected. About Globe Bank is not selected anymore. See how that works? So now it selects both the page and the subject. It's able to determine both of those at the same time. It's time for your first challenge assignment. I'm going to ask you to use some of the PHP skills that we've been using so far to add another feature to our navigation. I call it the collapsing navigation. Let me explain how it works, and then I'll demonstrate. The idea is that we're only going to list pages for the currently selected subject. So if a subject is selected, we see the pages that are underneath that subject. If it's not selected, then we would not see its pages. This kind of accordion effect, where the different subjects collapse and expand, is sometimes done with JavaScript, but we're not doing that here. We're going to be doing this just using PHP and HTML. So the way it's going to work is that each subject name is going to be a link. In fact, it already is. And clicking on one of those links is going to show the pages that are underneath that subject. Any other subjects that are not being shown would not show their pages. That also means that if no subject is selected, such as we're on the home page, then we wouldn't see any of the pages. We would just see a list of subjects. Now, once we click on one of those subjects, we don't want to just see the homepage content over on the far side. It also makes sense that we would see content that's relevant to that subject. So we're also going to see some default content on the right side when a subject is picked. It's going to default to be the first page underneath that subject. That's what we're going to see. So clicking a subject will expand the subjects to see its pages and show the first page of content over on the right. In case these objectives aren't clear, let me demonstrate. Here I am on our Globe Bank public homepage, and you can see currently you see a list of 4 subjects here, right? Each one of those is a link. I'm not seeing any pages whatsoever. No subject has been selected. When I click on About Globe Bank, a new page loads, and it knows now that About Globe Bank is the current subject. It shows us the pages that go below About Globe Bank, but it does not show us the pages underneath Consumer, Small Business, and Commercial. It also shows us the first page's content as the default for that page. When we click on Consumer, you can see that About Globe Bank hides its pages. Now we see the consumer pages, and the first page is showing its content as the default. It still also works when I click on a page so that those pages still show their content. But what's different now is that when I click on each of these subjects, they expand what's below them and hide all the others. See if you can work out how to do this on your own. In the next movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. Hopefully you did well with your first challenge assignment to build a collapsing navigation. In this movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. The first thing I did was I went into the navigation and I wanted to make that link for each subject be meaningful. So I added the subject ID to it. I wanted to be able to know which subject was currently selected. Now, there is the possibility that you could have tried to send the page ID to know which current page was selected, since we're going to be showing that page's content to begin with. But that would have required me to figure out the page ID before I started my loop through all of the different navigation pages. And that's a little bit tricky to do. I need to know it up here. And there are ways that you can work around it. You could not display these 3 lines until we actually get inside the loop, but that's a little bit clunky. I think a more elegant way to do it is just to go ahead and submit the subject ID here. So I'm using nav subject ID. I'm making sure that I URL encode it and I HTML escape it. So once I have that, now I have a link that will send that parameter. On index.php, I'm going to read that parameter. You can see that I already had code here to check and see if ID was set. I've added another bit here that checks to see if subject ID is set. So if ID wasn't set, then next check and see if we have a subject instead. So either we have a page, or we have a subject, or we have neither. Those are the 3 possibilities. So if it is set, then I'm going to just set subject underscore ID equal to that value. Now we'll come back to the rest of this in just a moment. For now, I have a subject ID. On my public navigation page, that means that then I can write a line of code here that just checks to see if subject ID is the current ID, then do my loop of pages. You see what I did? All I did was take all of that code and put it inside an if statement. If it's the current subject, loop through the pages. If not, then skip this part. Don't loop through the pages at all. So that's all it took to basically be able to click on a subject and have the pages expand or contract. But I didn't want to just do that on its own. I also want to make sure that I'm finding the default content to display. So that's what this next part does down here. I have its subject ID, so how do I find the first page? Well, I have this find pages by subject ID method already written. In fact, I'm using it here in the public navigation to find all the pages. So what if I just find all the pages, but then pull out the first one? So that's what I'm doing here. I have a page set. I'm finding all of them for that subject ID, and then I'm using MySQL fetch a sock, or associative array, out of that page set to get the first page. I don't care about the rest of them. In fact, I just free the result as soon as I've got that page. Now, if I didn't get a page for any reason, if that didn't return something meaningful, then we're going to redirect back to the home page. But assuming that there was a page there, then I'm going to set page ID equal to page, and now I have page set, just like I had page set up here, right? So now when I come on further down the page is going to be set, and it's going to display that page content for me. That's all it takes. Notice that inside this portion of the conditional, I'm setting 3 key variables: page ID, subject ID, and the page of content that I want to display. And I'm doing the same thing inside this block. I'm setting page ID, subject ID, and the page of content that I want to display. I'm just not doing them in the same order. Once we've got all that, we save it, we'll reload our page. Let's go back to the home page to start with, and you'll see that they are all collapsed, and they expand and behave exactly as I would expect, right? I get the default page of content, or I can pick another page underneath it, but clicking on a subject expands that subject and collapses all others. Hopefully you were able to come up with a similar solution. If not, take a few minutes so that you can get a working version on your own. In this movie, we're going to discuss how the public-facing version of our website is fundamentally different from the staff area, and what it means for us to be working in this public context so we can do it appropriately. We've already seen one key difference between the public side and the staff side, which is that the staff can edit content, right? They have access to all of that content management system we created, which does CRUD, create, read, update, and delete records. The public side, on the other hand, can only read content. They can't actually edit it. It's just there for them to view. In addition to that, there's some other more subtle differences. If you remember, we have a Boolean on both our subjects and pages table for visible. This is a common feature because it allows the staff to be able to create new content that's not yet visible to the public. They can get it staged, review it, get it all just like they like it, and then when it's ready to launch to the public, they can flip that Boolean from not visible to visible. Or the reverse, if they want to pull content off the website quickly, they can just change that one Boolean and that page will disappear from the website. In the staff area, we want to be able to see all of the subjects and pages, regardless of whether they're currently marked visible or not visible. We want to have access to everything. But the public should only see the visible subjects and pages. So we're going to need to account for that. In addition, the staff is going to be working with its content in the backend area in its raw form. That means the staff will want to be able to actually see the HTML tags that they're putting in, so they'll know what kind of HTML tag is being used. If it's an H1 tag or an H2 tag, that makes a difference, right, when we're editing it. But the public should only see the content in its finished form. We don't want them to see the tag. We want the tag to take effect. We want to actually see it be styled in HTML in its finished form. Because staff is able to work with content in its raw form, even when it's not a visible page yet, but they want to know what it's going to look like in its finished form, a common useful feature is for the staff to be able to preview those not yet visible pages. So staff has access to pages that are not visible, but they can view them in the public context, right? We're sort of crossing over the context so that in the public context, a staff member, someone who's logged in, can see what it's going to look like. But of course, the public should not be able to do that. They should not be able to see any content that's not yet visible, even to preview it. Here I am in the staff area that we created, and I'm in the subjects management area, and you can see that I've already got one of these subjects marked as visible false, small business. You can edit that if you haven't got it marked the same way. Make sure that one of them is set to be false. Now, if we go back and we look at the public page for this, you'll see small business is still showing up here. We don't want that, right? Small business should disappear. It should just be taken away. All of small business and all of its pages should not be visible to us. Now, let's also go back over here to our menu and let's go to pages. Now, all of my pages are currently marked as visible. Let's change that. Let's actually change this first one to make it not visible. And let's go back to the list and let's pick another one down here. I'll pick the very last one, Treasury Services, and let's make it not visible. Edit page. Okay, so now the first and the last one are marked false. Again, if we go back to our main content, you'll see About Globe Bank still shows up. And in commercial, we still see Treasury Services. Those should not show up in the public context. We still want to be able to see them here in the staff area because we want to be able to turn it on when we're ready, right? So we need to see it here, but we don't want the public to see it. There's several approaches that we could take to deal with this issue. We could write a new function. Instead of our find all subjects function, we could have find all visible subjects. It would be very similar. It would just include a check for whether or not the subject was visible inside the SQL query. We can also use our existing function, find all subjects, but then after we get back those records, as we're looping through them, we could skip any of them that are not marked as being visible. A third approach is we could use our find all subjects, but we could pass in an argument to indicate that we want visible to be true or not. So our function would be the same, but it would have conditional code inside that would modify the SQL to either include a check for visibility or not. And then a fourth possibility is instead of just providing an argument, we could have an associative array of options that we pass into the function. Now, all four of these would work, but they have different strengths and weaknesses. The first one would work just fine, but there's a fair amount of duplication there, right? It's going to be a very similar function to the one we already have, and we're going to have to do it for both subjects and for pages. The second version depends on us remembering to skip those records in all cases. And we'll see an example in the next movie of why this could be a problem. And then the third one uses the existing function, which keeps us from having duplication. But if we need to add additional options to it in the future, it means adding to that list of arguments. If there's only one, it works great, but we can easily expand over time to require 5 or 6 arguments, and then you have to consider the argument order and which ones are required and which ones have default values. The most flexible option is the last one. It leverages our existing function so we don't repeat ourselves, and it's easier to manage the options. They can appear in any order in the associative array, and the values are even labeled, which makes them clearer for us to read. We'll begin addressing this issue and modifying our site for the public context in the next movie. In the previous movie, we outlined a few approaches to prevent displaying subjects and pages which should not be visible in the public context. In this movie, we're going to try one of those approaches. That is, finding all subjects and pages, but then simply skipping any items which are not visible. You'll remember that the problem we have is that some of our pages are marked visible false in the staff area, and we want to see those in the staff area. But in the public area, we should not be seeing them. And that's true for Globe Bank, and it's also true down here for Treasury Services. There's also a subject we marked as not visible, which is small business. So that subject shouldn't show up at all. Now, one simple approach to this would be simply to go to our navigation. We find all of the subjects, but then when we start going through the loop of subjects, we would put in conditional code here that would check to see whether or not it was visible. Something like this. If nav underscore subject visible, And then we could put all of this code inside brackets, right? We could put all of this inside there, so it would only do that if it's visible. Or an even more efficient way to do it in PHP is to say if it's not visible, then continue. Continue is a PHP function for loop control. It basically just says start the next loop immediately. Don't bother with everything that's below it. Don't execute it. Don't even look at it. Go to the next loop, which would pull the next row of subjects out of the result set. And we could do that same code down here inside our loop for the pages, right? So it'll check and see if the page is not visible, then just go to the next page. Let's save it. Let's try that out. Let's reload our page. Look at that. Treasury Services disappeared and the subject small business disappeared. Click on About Globe Bank. We see that the Globe Bank item disappeared, right? That's correct. So it did correctly do it. It skipped all of those. However, notice that when I click on About Globe Bank, I'm still seeing the content that goes with that page. And that's because I've given this subject a default behavior and said, when you click on a subject, go get its first page and display it. Remember that code? Let's come back over here and look at that. It's in index.php, and it's right here. Find pages by subject ID. We have a subject ID that's been set, not a page ID. So we find the pages for that one, and we pull out the first page. We don't check for its visibility. We just get the first page. So you can see there's a problem here. We would actually need to write code, in this case, that would loop through and would keep pulling pages over and over and over in a loop until it found one that was visible. And you could certainly do it that way. But I think you can start to appreciate that the problem that we set out to solve is not quite as easy as we might first have assumed. I think that in many cases, it's a better approach to find only the records you need than to try and find all records and then sort through them after the fact. There's also some efficiency gains as well because we're not pulling back as much data from the database in the first place. So in the next movie, let's look at how we could approach it from that angle. In this movie, we will use an array of options with some of our functions to allow them to change their default behavior. Let me give you an example. Let's say we want to modify the behavior of our find all subjects function. We can pass in an argument to the function and then make the function respond to that argument. A good way to do this is to pass in an array of options instead of a single argument. That way we can easily add other options by adding to the array, but the argument list does not grow and become hard to manage. So you can see here I'm passing in options. I've got a default value, which is an empty array, so it is optional. We don't have to have anything sent in. But if we do, we can pass in an associative array, and we can respond to the values that are in that array. You can see here in my code, I'm checking the options to see if there is an option for visible. And if there is, I'm setting the variable visible to it. I'm also using the double question mark. That's the new null coalescing operator from PHP 7. It's a handy way to set it to a default value, so that if an option for visible is not sent, then it will default to being false. And then I can just use that inside my code. If visible is true, do one thing. If it's false, do something else. And as I said, we're not limited to just passing in one value, and we're not even limited to passing in Boolean values. You can pass in anything you want, and your function can be responsive to that. So here you can see I'm passing in order ascending as well. So presumably my function would take that into account and change its SQL to change the order of the results that were being returned. Notice also that one advantage of using an associative array is that all of our values that are being sent in are clearly labeled. We know what they are. Visible is what is true, right? If it's just a simple argument I'm passing in, find all subjects true, how do I know what true is? But by using an associative array, it makes it clear what these values mean. It also means that the order doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I put order ascending before visible true, those are still values inside the associative array. So that flexibility is a useful feature. So we just take those options, we pass them into our function, and the results we get back will be modified based on what we've passed in. This is a very handy technique to have in your developer toolbox. Let's try adding it to our project. So let's begin by first going to our public navigation, and let's just comment out the skipping that we did in the last movie. Right? So now there is nothing preventing the visible ones from showing up again, and let's try suppressing the visibility by modifying find all subjects so that it only finds visible subjects. So let's go into our query functions, and here's find all subjects. Let's add an option here, options, and then an empty array. Let's do the checking there to see what values are passed in. Options, if we have a value for visible, we'll use it. If not, let's use false. Now we need to modify the behavior based on this option. So what do we want to do? We want to change this SQL. What we want to do is add a where clause to it. So if visible has been set and is true, then let's add to our SQL. Concatenate. It's going to be where visible equals true. And then a space. Make sure you have the space at the end of it. It's very important that we always are able to concatenate these together and it all still makes sense, right? Whether it's included or not, the SQL still should be able to work. All right, so now that we've got that, let's save it. Let's go back to our public navigation, and we just need to tell find all subjects to use that option. And we do that by just passing in visible is true. All right, let's go back over to our page. We'll reload, and look at that. We don't see our small business link, right? It's not there anymore. It's not because we're skipping it. It's because we're never finding it. Now for the pages, we are still seeing the pages because we haven't done anything about the pages yet. It's only subjects we've dealt with so far. So let's go back to our query functions. We want to do the same thing. Actually, let's grab this first before we head over there. Let's go to the public navigation. Let's copy this associative array we have. And down here where we're finding the pages, we're using find pages by subject ID. Now we're passing in an ID. We want to put the options after that ID. Why is that? Well, because this is actually required. This is not optional. This is something we have to have. We have to have a subject ID in order for this to work, for find pages by subject ID. This is only for options, only for things that are optional, ways we want to modify it. Its fundamental behavior requires that we have this first item. So the options come at the end, and they are in fact optional. All right, so let's save that. Now let's go back and modify that function to work the same way. Let's grab this line 8 before we do. I'm just going to copy it. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this. Down here is where we're going to find that find pages by subject ID. So I'm just going to paste that line in there. We know we want to make sure that we allow the options. And we're going to check. We're going to set visible. It's going to default to false. Now we just need to modify behavior based on it. Now this one already has a where clause, so it's a little bit different. Before we were adding a where clause in that case. Now we need to modify it so that we have if visible, then SQL is going to add on an and clause where subject ID equals whatever has been provided and visible equals true. Space. Make sure the space is at the end again. Very important that it always still can be concatenated together correctly. All right, so now we're passing in the option, we're setting it to a default value, and we're responding and adjusting the behavior if that option is sent in. Let's try it out. Let's reload our page. Treasury Services disappeared. Let's click on About GlobeBank. And sure enough, GlobeBank disappeared. Now About GlobeBank is still showing up. That's because that's actually in a different place here. I'm just going to grab this associative array real quick from here so I don't have to retype it. We also want to check here on index.php, find pages by subject ID. It needs to also use that same option, visible, true. Save it, reload our page, and sure enough, now the first page is the first visible page. So clicking on a subject doesn't return the first page anymore, it returns the first visible page. And that's the behavior we would expect. Being able to pass in options to your functions is a really useful technique to have. Let's take a moment to talk about a security issue in our application's public context. It has a name, Insecure Direct Object Reference. It's also called IDOR for short. Insecure Direct Object Reference is when code fails to verify a user's authorization before giving access to a restricted resource. Put another way, there exists a direct reference to an object which is insecure. Basically, you're viewing something you should not be able to see. This has been ranked as the #4 security threat by OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. So it's a big deal and it's very common. It can mean that you simply fail to check that a user is logged in before you give them access to a page that should be password protected, but it doesn't have to be that. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we have a URL that is the receipt we get at the end of our transactions on an online store, right? So I have our receipt ID SS48923. So then we have PHP code that's going to take that URL, it's going to look at that ID, it's going to go to the database and look for the orders and find the invoice ID that matches. This is the direct object reference. A user has direct access to the invoice. The invoice ID goes directly to the SQL and returns back the data. It's insecure because there's never any verification that the user is authorized to view this invoice. Not only could anyone use the same URL to access this invoice, but entering other invoice IDs such as SS48924 or 25 or 26 would most likely provide insecure access to other invoices. And those invoices might reveal someone else's name, address, phone, items they ordered, their credit card, or more. And it doesn't just have to be database data. It can also be files, directories, scripts, or even functions. Anything that we're providing as a resource to the user, something that they can get their hands on, but we don't check and make sure that they're authorized and that they should be able to get their hands on it, then it's insecure. If a user can trigger what should be a privilege result without having to validate those privileges, then it's a case of insecure direct object reference. So now that we know what it is, let's look for these types of problems in our application. Now, insecure direct object reference is part of the reason why we structured things so that we have a private directory and we have a public directory. Everything that's in the public directory is accessible, and that's the way we want it. We want the user to be able to get their hands on our images and our style sheets. We don't want them to have access to view our functions or our database credentials. So that's why we've structured things in this way, is for precisely this reason, to help make sure that we keep these resources secure. Now, there is one big problem that we have, which is that our staff area is completely insecure at the moment. There's no username or password required to get in here and start editing stuff. That's a problem we're going to be addressing later on in this course. So it's a known issue. But there's another place that I want us to look that's something we might not think about, and it has to do with the visibility of these pages that we've just been working with. Notice now that I'm not seeing my pages listed in my navigation, and I'm not getting them pulled up by default when I click on one of these subjects. That's great. But let's click on leadership. Notice here it says index.php ID equals 3. And it's going to the database, and it's pulling back the page of content that has ID 3. So now let's change this URL, and let's make it ID 2. Oh, now I'm getting back history, right? Now let's go up and change it again. Now let's make it ID equals 1. Look at that. I'm getting the page that should not be visible, right? There's an insecure reference. This page should be excluded from the public context so that the public doesn't have access to it. But by changing the URL, by monkeying around with those strings, they're able to get access to it anyway. We need to make sure that we restrict access to this content in the public context, even if it's not listed in the navigation. It's an important point, and it's often overlooked. Let's see how we can fix that in the next movie. In the last movie, we learned about insecure direct object reference, and we saw that our page content is vulnerable. In this movie, we're going to fix it. You'll recall the problem was that we were able to craft a URL that has ID equals 1, and our application still returns the page content for that page that should be hidden. It should be not visible, but it still returns that to us, even though it's not in the navigation anywhere. We suppressed it from the navigation, but we still were able to make a direct object reference to it, and it's not secure. We should be hiding it. The solution to that is simply to go in and find the code that's being called. Here you see we're calling find page by ID in order to find that page. When we pass in an ID, it calls find page by ID, but it doesn't do any kind of checking for visibility. What we want is to take this option that we pass in down here and add it up here as well. So find page ID will also call visibility true. Now we put it after the page ID because the page ID is actually required. The function has to have this to work. This is an array of options that comes after the required arguments. So we're passing that in, but we're not actually doing anything with it yet. We need to go to our query functions, and we need to find our function. Let's scroll up. Here I'm in my pages. Go past the validations. Here we are. Find page by ID. What I need to do is add the same kind of options to this that we were working with before. So visible equals options visible, and we'll use false as a default. And now we need to modify our SQL so that if visible, then we're going to use the append, and we're going to add and. So we had where ID equals something and visible equals true. And let's put semicolon at the end. Now I also need to make sure I have a space right here so that it can be concatenated together correctly. That's always very important. I could also put the space at the beginning, but I like putting them at the end of my lines. All right, so that should take care of it. Now we're able to pass in an option, read that option, set it to a default value if none was given, and then use it to modify the behavior of find page by ID. Let's go and try that out. Let's reload our page. And sure enough, it redirected us to our home page. That's what happened. And that makes sense because if we look at index.php, it tried to find the page by the ID using the fact that it should be visible. It didn't find anything, so it redirected us to the home page. Now, there's also another one in here that we may not have caught yet. Notice that if I click on consumer, it says subject ID equals 2, and I see the content for banking, right? What if I type in subject ID equals 3? That's a subject that's not visible. Remember? Come back over here. Subjects, small business is false. Let's take a look at small businesses pages. You'll see the first one is called checking. Well, look what we're getting here, business checking. We're still seeing the page of content. So why is that? We just told it that the page should not show if it's not visible. But that was a different bit of code. That was up here. If the subject ID is set, then we're taking the subject ID and we're asking to find the pages by subject ID. Now, we're finding only visible pages and getting the first one, right? So the page is visible. It's the subject that's not visible. And we're not doing any kind of checking to see whether or not that subject is visible. And we're not querying the subjects table at all to find out that information. In order to find it out, we have to add that query. There's no way around it. We have to actually do a query to find out. So we need to do subject equals find subject by ID, and then we'll pass in that subject ID. We also want to take this same associative array, put it right after it, and pass that in. And then we'll say, now if you did not get a subject out of that, if the subject doesn't exist in the database, or if there's not a visible subject in the database, then what do we want to do? We want to redirect as well. I'll just paste this here. Now that's doing it in this case. Let's also go ahead and check and make sure the subject is visible here. We asked for a page. The page is visible, but the subject is not. And let's show you an example of that. You see that this page here is page 8. Let's go back. Let's ask for ID 8, right? It still gives us that page, but it shouldn't, right? It should be restricted because the subject is also not visible. So let's add that code in here as well. So we have a subject ID. Let's stop and take a moment, just make sure that it does exist in the database and that it is visible as well. Okay, so that's find subject by ID. We added all that code in there, but our query function still doesn't take that into account. Let's scroll up here. Find subject by ID does not have this same code. So let's just add this in real quick. We know the steps we need to do. We've done it a few times now. And then we'll just modify this SQL. Let's add a space here at the end. And then let's say if visible, we're going to append to the SQL, and visible equals true. Okay, so now it should do it in that case too. Let's go back and look. So let's reload our page. Sure enough, it took us back to the home page. Click on consumer. Let's change this one to 3. And sure enough, it took us back to the home page. There's no way around it. In order to make sure that the subject should be visible and should not be authorized, we do have to make that additional trip to the database to bring back that data and take a look at it. There are more advanced techniques you can use so that you can actually use SQL join tables and look at 2 different tables at once, but those are more advanced. For now, let's keep it simple. And let's just make that additional query and make sure we don't accidentally have an insecure direct object reference in our code. Now that we've addressed the issues around page visibility in the public context, let's move on to another difference that we highlighted at the beginning of this chapter. The staff context and the public context are going to handle the HTML that's stored in the database for our page content differently. In the staff area, when we view a page, we want to see the HTML. We want to see, for example, that history has been wrapped inside H1 tags. That's meaningful to us in the staff area. But for the public, when we go to present this data, we don't want that. We want history to actually be inside H1 tags. We want it to be actual HTML so that all the behaviors and styles associated with that tag take effect. Now you may remember that the way we got this to work originally was by removing the escaping that we normally do around this content. In part 1 of this course, we created this special helper method, a shortcut called H. And what that function does is it converts any special HTML characters in that content into harmless equivalent character entities. Let me show you. Let's put the H back, let's save it. Let's go back to Firefox and let's reload the page. You'll see we get something like what we get in the staff area. That's because this less than sign is no longer part of an HTML tag. It gets converted to an HTML character entity that looks like an HTML tag, but doesn't have the same power and meaning to HTML. And the reason why we did that, we talked about in part 1 of this course, and that's to prevent things like cross-site scripting, to prevent tags from being harmful or malicious. So the question then is, how can we have our content be displayed to the public as HTML, but still get the HTML escaping? So we make sure that malicious content doesn't show up unexpectedly. There are a few different approaches we could use. The first is that we could write our own symbolic language. We would come up with some kind of substitute for HTML in our text. So an easy example of that might be that instead of using less than and greater than around our HTML tags, we might use curly braces. So the curly braces would not be seen as being HTML, they'd be harmless, but then before we display it, we could convert those into being actual HTML tags. Now, if we're going to go to the trouble of inventing our own symbolic language, it's worth considering many people have approached this problem before, and there's some really good solutions out there. One of the most popular of these is Markdown. Markdown is used in a lot of contexts. You may have used it before. You can find out more information about it at daringfireball.net/projects/markdown. This is going to tell you about Markdown, but if you actually want to use it, you've got to install a PHP Markdown library, something that will convert the Markdown symbolic language into HTML using PHP. If you search for Markdown in PHP, you'll find that there are a number of those out there. Another possibility is to install a PHP library like HTML Purifier. This will make sure that HTML is safe and allows you to whitelist certain tags that you want to allow in, and it watches for lots of tricks that hackers use to sneak in malicious code. It's a very powerful and professional library. But before we start writing our own language or using third-party libraries, PHP also gives us a pretty good tool that we can use that's much easier. That is strip tags. Strip tags takes an argument, which is a string, and it strips all of the HTML tags out of that string. Plain and simple. That's what it says. Strip tags. It strips the tags out. But the real power here is that we also have the ability to specify the allowable tags. We are allowed to whitelist tags that we want to be allowed to be in the string, and those will be able to remain. Now, in addition to HTML, I also want to mention that there's another very helpful PHP formatting function, which is NL2BR. Now, that looks kind of cryptic, but what it actually stands for is new line to, meaning convert to, a BR tag. So it converts all new lines in the text into HTML BR tags. Now, if you're writing HTML, you probably don't need that. But if you've just got paragraphs of text and they don't have HTML in them, let's say that your users don't know anything about HTML, and you just want to take all the new line returns and turn those into HTML line breaks, well, this is the function that can help you do that. So it depends on the context. It depends if you want new lines to be converted into BR tags, or if that's already going to be taken care of. In our content that we're using, it's already written in HTML, and any BR tags that should be in there are already included. So we won't need that. But we are going to make use of strip tags. So right here, let's take out our note to add this HTML escaping back in, because what we're going to do is wrap strip tags around our content. Now let's just like that, just to see what that does. Let's come back over here and let's reload our page. And you'll see it just takes all the tags out, right? We aren't getting anything in there, not even new lines. Incidentally, if you did want to try it, NL2BR, you can wrap that around it. Let's see what that gives us. You'll see we get some line returns, right? You see how that works. So that's a proof of how that works. But we don't want that. We don't want NL2BR around it. What we want is to specify the tags that ought to go in. And I like to do this by actually declaring a separate string, allowed tags. Makes it a little easier. This is a string and not an array. That often trips me up. I often forget. I need to specify the tags using their less than and greater than symbols on either side of them. So I'm going to let in divs, I'm going to let in image tags, I'm going to let in h1 and h2 tags. Let's also let in any paragraph and BR tags. I'm going to allow people to use strong and EM for emphasis, and UL and LI. They can make lists in there. Okay, so those are the tags I'm going to allow them to use. That's called a whitelist. A blacklist would be if we were forbidding things. This is a whitelist. We're allowing these tags to go in. So let's save it. Let's go back over and let's try it out. Reload our page, and we get what we'd expect. Now, if I'd had something in there like a script tag that did something malicious, it would get stripped out. It would not be allowed in there. So now we're able to store HTML content in the database. We're able to view it in its appropriate form in the staff area. We're able to put it into the public area in its presentation form, and also ensure that any bad tags are filtered out at the same time. It's time for another challenge assignment. In the beginning of this chapter, we discussed that it's a useful feature for staff to be able to preview content as it would be formatted in the public context, even when that content is still not yet visible to the public. Your challenge is to implement that preview feature. Let's go over a few of the key points together. You want to add a preview link in the staff area on public staff pages show.php. You can put it right before the edit and delete links. And in that link, you want to include the URL parameter preview equals true. When that link is clicked, it's going to open the public index.php page. That is the home page that the public normally sees. You're going to do that in a new window. You can do that using target equals blank in HTML to bring up a new window. And when it goes to render the page, it's going to work just like normal, except when it's in preview mode like this, it's not going to check for page or even subject visibility. It's going to just ignore all of those checks that we put in place earlier, because we assume that we're allowed to do this. Now, ideally, we're going to want to put that previewing behind a user login. Only a logged in user ought to be able to preview, right? We don't want the public to be able to preview, or we will have created an insecure direct object reference. And we already learned why we don't want to do that. We're going to worry about configuring the user's login status later on. Don't worry about that for now. For now, build the feature as it is, and you'll know that you have it working when you can go into the staff area, find a page which is not supposed to be visible, click on the preview link, and see the content as the public would if it were visible. But if you try to view that same page without having preview equals true in the URL, then you can't see the page. I will give you one helpful hint. It's useful to set a variable that controls whether the page is visible or not, and then you can refer to that variable anytime you need. So give this challenge a try on your own, and then in the next movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. In the last movie, I gave you a challenge assignment to implement the preview content feature in our application. That would allow a staff member to be able to preview content that's not yet visible to the public, but to preview it in the same way that the public would eventually see it. Hopefully you did well with it. Now let me show you the solution that I came up with. The first thing that I did was I went into the public directory, into staff, into pages, and found show.php. And on that page, I added a link. I went ahead and added a div called class actions and a link, which I gave a class of action. And the href for that is going to be for that index.php page, right? That's the home page that we've been looking at. And I gave it an ID, a page ID that we want to look at. That's the current page ID that I'm working with in the staff area. I used good escaping techniques on that using URL encode and HTML special chars. So it's going to have both of those shortcuts applied to it. And then you'll notice that I've also added and preview equals true. That's going to make sure that that gets added after the ID and is available in the URL string. It's what's going to trigger preview mode. Notice that I also added an attribute for target equals _ blank. That'll make sure that it pops up in a new window. Let's take a look at this in the staff area. So here I am. I'm going to find one that's not visible, like this one right here. It says visible false. I'm going to click on view, and now I've got a preview link right here. I'm going to click on that. A new tab opens up, and you'll see that I am seeing the content. Notice it says preview equals true here. Now let's take a look at what happens when we actually hit that page. On index.php, I added some code right here at the top that would figure out whether or not preview had been set. By default, preview is set to false, Now, if it's set in the get parameters, then I'm going to check and see if its value is equal to true. I'm using a ternary operator here. That's what this form is called. This is the conditional statement. If this is the case, this is the value that gets returned, true. Otherwise, it's false. So that's going to set the value of preview based on what's sent in the actual preview URL parameter. And then I set another one here called visible. And this just makes it easy for me to keep track of. If visible is true, then we want to pass visible as a condition all the way down the line. So that's the opposite of preview, right? If preview is set to true, then visible ought to be set to false, right? It can get a little tricky to think about which one is which. But now I have visible that I can just pass in every time I'm passing in this hash. So it'll be true or false depending on the status of visibility. And every single time that I'm calling that, I'm passing that value in. So one master variable up here controls the setting for all of those. Not only that, when we get down here and we include our public navigation, it still has access to that variable. Now I've gone ahead and added visible equals visible and defaults to true just in case it's not set, but I also am using it here for finding all subjects and for finding all pages. Now it's not strictly necessary, but I am doing it so that the overall experience is to disable the visibility checking that we had in place. And then there's one more thing that I went ahead and did, which was not part of the assignment, but it's just a nice little perk, which is in the public header, up in the title, I've said if preview is set and preview is true, then echo preview after whatever the title might be. That just gives me a way to let me know that I'm in preview mode in the title of the page. So let's try it all out again. Let's come back over here. You'll see that it worked when it brought up the new page. You'll see it says preview here. That's what I've added. And you'll see that I am seeing a preview of this page, even though it's not visible. If I click on history, you'll see it goes away because preview equals true went away, right? Let's click back. Let's take preview true away from this one, and it should just disappear on its own, right? So preview equals true is a bit of magic because setting that value enables or disables the visibility that we've been setting throughout the rest of this chapter. Hopefully you were able to come up with a similar solution. If not, spend a few minutes making sure that you understand how it works. In this chapter, we're going to be learning about how to work with cookies and sessions in PHP. This is an important topic because cookies and sessions are going to allow us to store data, but more importantly, they're going to be the tools that enable us to perform authorization or user logins in the next chapter. So let's start by talking about cookies and learn how those work. You're probably familiar with cookies at least a little bit. A cookie is a small string of data that's stored by the user's web browser. And the best way to understand cookies is to watch them in action. So the process begins when a user's web browser sends a request to a web server. And that request would include a header that looks something like this. This is a simplified version, but you can see it's sending a request to fakesite.com and it's requesting the page first.php. Nothing special about that, but that's what starts the process. Then when the web server responds back to the browser, it sends back a response. And that response is probably a lot of HTML that the browser can display. But in the header of that response, the web browser can include a directive called setCookie. You can see it there in the third line, setCookie, and then a string of data follows. That's the data that's going to be sent to the browser and that the web server is saying, hey browser, store this data for later. Then, whenever the browser makes another request back to that same web server in the future, it's going to include that cookie data in its request header. Notice how this is very similar to what we had on the first slide, where we were asking for first.php, but now I'm asking for a new page, second.php, and I have that additional third line in there where the cookie data is being sent along. That's sent along on every single request, regardless of what page it's for, as long as it's for that same website domain. So that's how cookies work. Cookies are stored by website domain. So each website domain or subdomain, if you've configured it that way, will have its own unique set of cookies. And those cookies are going to be sent with every single request to that website domain or subdomain. For that reason, we want to keep cookies small. It's a small bit of data that's being sent with every single request that we make. Cookies actually have a maximum size of 4 kilobytes. That's around 4,000 characters. But you wouldn't want to use all of that. You wouldn't want to send 4,000 characters with every single request that you make to the website, whether it be for some JavaScript or an image or anything like that. you would be sending that data each and every time. We want to keep cookies and cookie data small. It's also important to keep in mind that cookies are stored on a user's computer in their browser. And that means the user has control over that data. It means they can view the data, they can edit it, or they can just delete the cookies. They can clear them all if they want. That becomes important when we start talking about secure features, right? Because the user can view the data, it may not be secret. They can edit the data, so it may not be perfectly secure, or the data may not be reliable. It may just disappear on us if the user deletes it. So it's important to keep this in mind when we're working with cookies. Once cookies are received by PHP in the header, PHP automatically takes those values and makes them available to us in a super global, the same way as it does for get values and post values that are received. You'll remember that we use superglobals $_get and $_post when we're working with those. Now we're going to have $_cookie that's going to be the superglobal that contains all of our cookie values. Those are going to be key value pairs stored in an associative array, just like we have when we're working with get and post. You'll recall from when we just saw the walkthrough of how cookies work, that cookies are being set and sent in the HTTP headers. That's an important point because headers are sent before any page data. We talked about this a lot in the first part of this course. That means that cookies must be set by PHP before any output is made, even white space. The only way around that is to have output buffering turned on. We talked about that in the first part of this course when we talked about redirecting. And at that time, we talked about output buffering and we turned output buffering on. But it's something to keep in mind. Cookies follow the same rule because cookies are set and sent in the headers. Now that we understand the mechanics of cookies, let's talk about how we actually set them in PHP. In this movie, we'll learn to use PHP to set and read cookie values. PHP has a function for setting cookie values, and it's called setCookie. It takes a number of different arguments, but there are three that are the most important: the name of the cookie, the value we want to assign to that name, and then the expiration. That is, we can control how long these cookies stick around for. We'll talk a bit more about the expiration in a minute, but just know that you can choose whether this cookie sticks around for a day or whether it should stick around for 10 years. It's up to you. There are a few other arguments you can provide as well. Here's a full list of all of them. We've got name, value, and expire, but then after that you can also specify the path and the domain. The path is the path on the server to which the cookie is available. So for example, we could have a cookie that's only available if our path is in the staff area. Domain would be typically the entire domain, the entire website, but we can also limit it to a certain subdomain if we wanted, using this option. And then the last two are about the cookie's security. If secure is true, then a cookie will only be transmitted when there's a secure HTTPS connection. Otherwise, the cookie will not be transmitted. HTTP only says that this cookie should only be sent along with the header. In other words, it should not be available to JavaScript. What we're doing is keeping hackers from being able to use JavaScript to steal cookie data from us. Let's talk a bit more about cookies expiration and how we set that. The cookie expiration is always going to be a Unix timestamp. That is the number of seconds since 1970. That can seem like it's difficult to calculate until you realize that PHP has a function that can really help you, which is time. Time returns the current time right now expressed as a Unix timestamp, or expressed as the number of seconds since 1970. So we can use that as a starting point and then perform some calculations to move ourselves forwards and backwards in time from that timestamp. So if we want to set an expiration 2 weeks from now, we could do it like this: time plus, and then you can see I'm multiplying some numbers together. That's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, times 14, and that gives us 14 days. This is a common way to do it. So we're basically saying take the current time and add the number of seconds that are in 14 days to it, and that's our expiration. Once we perform that calculation, we can pass it into setCookie, and here you can see I'm setting the language preference equal to English. If you want to see it with all of the options, again, I'm just breaking it onto several lines so that you can see them more easily. We've got those same first three. The fourth option is saying that the path ought to be for the entire website. The domain says it's not for a subdomain, it's for this site called mysite.com. I'm saying that it's not a secure cookie. It can be transferred over non-HTTPS connections. And I'm saying that it is HTTP only, meaning that JavaScript can't access this cookie. As I mentioned in the last movie, once cookie values are received by PHP, PHP takes all those values sent in the request header and puts them into an associative array that's assigned to the superglobal cookie. That's cookie singular, not plural, even though it might contain data from several cookies. It's the cookie data that we're talking about. And there's key value pairs in there, and we want back a value. We ask that associative array for its matching key. So here I'm asking for the cookie for lang, and I would get back that language preference that was stored. Now, if it hadn't been set, or if a user has deleted it, then it won't be in the associative array, and we'll get back a warning or an error. So it's always a good idea to just check and make sure that it is there and to have a default value in case it's not. This is one way you can do it using isSet. If you have PHP 7, you can use the null coalescing operator. That's the double question mark to do it in a shorthand. Now I should mention there's one detail that sometimes trips beginners up, which is that when we set a cookie, we're saying that it should be set in the header that will be returned back to the user. We won't get that value back into this superglobal until the next request comes in. It's important to understand that. When we set a cookie, we're not setting a value in this superglobal. This superglobal is what came in the previous request. So it's only on the next request that we would get any values that we've just set. That can sometimes trip beginners up because they go looking in that superglobal and they're like, well, wait a minute, I just set a cookie. Why is the value not in there? Well, this is the data that came in from the previous request, not what the state of the cookie will be in the future. Let's try an example in our project. You can see that I have a new PHP file here called language.php that's going to be in your exercise files. I'm just going to drag that into the public directory. And before we look at the code, let's just look at it in the browser to see what it does. I'm not going to make a link to this page. We're just going to go to it directly by typing language.php from the public directory. And you can see that it just says set language preference. The currently selected language is any, and then you have some choices here. I have a pull down where I can choose from a few different languages. If I choose English and click set preference, then it remembers that my preference is English. And even if I go back and reload this page, right? Go back up here, click again, hit return every time, you can see that it still remembers what my language preference was. That's because it's being stored in a cookie. Okay, so now we see how it works. Let's take a look at the code. Go into language.php, and let's look down here at the form first of all. Set language preference, the currently selected language is, and it just displays whatever that current language is. And then we have a form that submits to itself as a post request. It has that select option. The value is going to be called language. We have some language choices. I picked a few different languages. You can certainly modify it to add your own. That's by no means a comprehensive list. And then I'm iterating through those choices and marking selected if it matches the current language for each one. And then I've got submit down at the bottom. All right, so let's go up here and look at the top. I've said that if it's a post request, if the form has been submitted, then let's get that post value for language, whatever was submitted. We'll default to any if for some reason that value is not there. It should be there, but just in case. And then we'll set that to language. Then I'm going to set the expiration time as the current time plus, and here's a calculation. Do you see how long that's going to last for? 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, times 365 gives us 1 year. So this is going to last for 1 year. You can see that I'm then setting the cookie. The name of the cookie is going to be language. The value is whatever the form sent in. I'm going to use that expiration. Now, if it's a GET request, if it's not a POST request, in other words, we're just visiting this page for the first time or we've typed the URL in, then it's just going to read that cookie data back. So it's going to read back the cookie data assigned to the name language, and that's what it's going to be. So that's what we're seeing happening. That works exactly as we'd expect. Let's go back over here. Let's choose French. Set preference, and now it's French. Now that was a POST request. Let's go up here into the URL and I'll hit return. Now that was a GET request, right? And it still remembers that it was French. It still is pulling that cookie value back and then down here, outputting that value. In this movie, we're going to talk about how you unset cookie values because it's not as obvious as you might first think. A lot of beginners think that you can unset a cookie by using PHP's unset function. After all, that works to unset the value of a variable. It even works to unset the value of an associative array. And after all, this is an associative array stored in the superglobal cookie. But this will not work. Why not? Well, remember, the superglobal cookie contains the values received from the previous request. That's all it is. Those values came in the request, PHP grabbed them, put them all together, and put them here in the associative array so we'd have easy access to them. It has nothing to do with communicating to the browser that it should delete the data that it has stored. All it would do is simply modify the associative array that we have, and the next request that came in, the browser would send its stored data in again. The cookie would not have gone away. Instead, we need to actually communicate to the browser that it should delete that cookie. And there's two ways that we can do this in PHP. The first is we can set the value of the cookie to false. The second is that we can set the expiration time to some time in the past. And that will tell the browser, hey, this cookie's no good anymore, it's expired, therefore we should delete it. Now, what actually happens behind the scenes when you do the first one, when you set it to false, is PHP is actually setting the expiration to 1 year in the past. So they both do the same thing. It can be a little easier to remember the version that sets it to false than it is the expiration of the time, but they both do the same thing. There are a couple of points that this raises though. The first is that if using false will unset a cookie, then we want to be sure to avoid Boolean values whenever we're setting cookies, right? We don't want to delete the cookie accidentally if we're trying to store the fact that the value is false. So instead, when we're using values of true and false with cookies, we want to store 0 or 1 instead, because those don't have that side effect of deleting the cookie. Another important point is that cookies can only be deleted by using the same options as were used when setting the cookie. So if you supplied options for the path, the domain, whether this cookie should be secure or if it's HTTP only, then you must use those same options again when you go to unset the cookie and delete it. In this movie, we're going to learn about sessions. Sessions solve a similar problem to cookies, but they do it in a different way, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. So let's talk about how we work with sessions in PHP. When we're going to work with sessions, the way the process works is that we're going to store data in a session file. That's going to be a file that's on the web server. We're not sending the data off to the user for them to put in a cookie. Instead, what we're going to do is send a reference identifier for that session file to the user as a cookie. So the user still gets a cookie, but they don't get actual data. What they get is a reference identifier for a file that sits on the web server. And then PHP will handle the retrieval of that session file. It'll take the cookie data, it'll see the reference identifier, it'll go to the file system, find the file, open it up, and get the values that are in the session out of there ready for us to use. So why do it this way? Well, for one thing, sessions can have a lot more storage. You'll remember that cookies were limited to 4K of data. That's not the case with sessions. We can store a lot of information in those files. Sessions also mean that we have smaller request sizes. You'll remember with cookies, the cookie data is sent with every single request. It doesn't matter if that request is for an HTML page, or if it's for a piece of JavaScript, or for an image file. It sends the cookie data along with every request. If that's large, that can be quite a bit of data that we're sending along. With sessions, the only thing that gets sent is the session identifier, a very small piece of data. It also allows us to conceal the data values. Remember, with cookies, the data sits on the user's browser. The user has the ability to view that data or even to modify it. But with sessions, all of that data is going to be stored on the web server. The user can't see it. The user can't modify it. So it makes it more secure and less hackable. Now, there are some downsides to using sessions as well. One is that they are a little bit slower to access. And if you think about it, it makes sense. With a cookie, we just read the cookie value and we have it. With sessions, we have to read the cookie value, get the session identifier, go to the file system, get the file, open it up, read the contents of the file, and the process just takes longer to do all those steps. The other thing about sessions is they're designed to expire when the browser is closed. So the cookies normally would stick around. We can keep those around for a month or a year or 10 years. But a session usually expires when the browser's closed. That's why it's called a session. You open up a session, and then when you close your browser, your session is over. And then another problem can be that session files can accumulate. They take up space on the hard drive, right? We're using that for storage, and we can store a lot of data in there. If we're not careful, that can get out of control. We can store too much data in there, or those files cannot go away over time and build up. Now, PHP has some garbage collection built into it so that it does delete session files periodically. But if you're working on a really high traffic site or on a web server that doesn't have a lot of hard drive space, it's something to keep an eye on. So what are some uses for sessions? Well, one good thing is for frequently referred to data, things that we just don't want to have to look up in a database or something else over and over. Instead, we'll just grab it out of the session data. Another primary use for it, and one that we're going to be using it for, is for user authentication, where you can store the fact that a user is logged in, and we can store details about that user in the session. And we want to keep that information secure and not editable. If we store it in a cookie, the user has the ability to manipulate it potentially. Maybe they pretend to be a different user, right? Use a different user ID so that we think that they're a different user. If it's stored in the session, they can't do that. If you remember, in part 1 of this course, we talked about redirects and how redirects are actually a new browser request. And so we're starting from scratch when that request comes in. So it can be very helpful to use the session to store data that we want to persist through that redirect. That could be a message, it could be details about errors, or it might be keeping track of the URL that someone had requested previously, right? We can store all of that and still have it available to us when the next request comes back after the redirect. So how do we start sessions? Well, the first thing is you need to go to your php.ini file and take a look there for ways that you can configure sessions. Most of the default configurations are probably fine, but you can also find out more information on the php.net website about the different options and how you can set them. You can also configure the session cookie options there, deciding how long those cookies are going to be around, for example. By default, they disappear whenever the browser is closed, but that doesn't have to be. You can configure that. And you should also know that sessions are going to be turned off by default. So when you just have a basic PHP page, it doesn't have access to the sessions right away because they're turned off. You have to issue a command to start a session. And so we'll have to put session start in our code in order to get that started. Later versions of session start also let you provide options similar to the options you can provide in the php.ini file so that you can configure the session at the time that you start it. In the next movie, let's get some hands-on experience with sessions. In this movie, we'll learn how to use PHP to set and read values in the session file. In order to set a value in the session, all we have to do is use the superglobal and assign a value to a key, just like we would any associative array. It's that simple. We don't have to use a special command like we did with setCookie. Here we just simply talk to the associative array and PHP will then store that value in the session file for us. That's very different than when we're working with the cookie. We have a live connection, a live association between the contents of our session file and the superglobal session. When we want to read a value back, then we just simply ask for the value that relates to that key for the associative array. So here I'm asking for session lang, and I would get back the value English. Now, it's a good idea to make sure that that value exists. Otherwise, if we ask for a key in an associative array that doesn't exist, we'd get an error. So you want to check and see whether it's set, and also set it to a default value if it's not there. The shorthand for doing that if you have PHP 7 is to use that double question mark, the null coalesce operator. It does the same thing as the line above it, it's just a little shorter. Now, if we want to unset values from the session, it's much easier than working with the cookie also. Again, we don't have to use setCookie and put anything in the headers. We have access to the session file directly, and we can just simply call unset on it. That's what we might have thought we could do with cookies. You can't do it there, but you can do it with the session. Let's try an example using the session in our project. In the last movie, I told you that one of the things that sessions can be useful for is for remembering frequently used data that's used often, that we don't want to have to go to the database and look up. So the idea behind what I want to add to our project is we're going to record the user's username. When they log into the staff area, we'll put their username in the session, so we'll have quick reference to it. We won't have to go back to the database and look the user up again each and every time we need to display their username. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to turn on the sessions. Sessions are not on by default, and the best place for us to turn it on is in initialize.php. And that way, it'll make sure that sessions are always turned on and always available to us throughout our entire application, because everything is calling initialize.php. So let's put it right here. Let's do session underscore start, turn on sessions. Now we have access to sessions. Now we have access to that super global anytime we want. So in order to use it, I'm going to add a couple of pages to my project. These are going to be in your exercise files and you can find them there. The first is going to be login.php, and the second is logout.php. I'm going to grab those. I'm going to drag them into my public staff directory. Make sure you put them in there right alongside index, pages, and subjects. Let's take a look at those pages. These are placeholder pages for work that we're going to be doing later on. You see right now, this is just a basic login form. We're going to eventually type our username and password, and we're going to authenticate that user. We'll learn to do that in the next chapter. For now, we're going to do much less than that. Let me show you the code so you'll understand. Let's switch over here and let's go take a look at login.php. You'll see it calls initialize. We're setting up some variables. If it's a post request, we're going to do some business here. We'll come back to that. But if it's not, if it's a GET request, then we just display a form, right? Just a basic password form ready for us to submit. When we submit it, then this code is triggered. It's a post request at that point. And so we're going to get the values that were submitted for the username and the password. And then all I'm going to do is take the value for the username and put it in the session. Now, eventually, we're going to check and make sure that the username and the password matches and that the user can be logged in, and then we would record the username. But we're not going to do that for now. For now, just submitting the form is enough to get us to record the username, and then we're going to redirect the user to the staff index.php page. Let's go to that staff index.php page because on this page, I want us to actually see the results of that. Notice we've got that staff header up at the top. Let's go into staff header.php. And right here, we've got an li tag. Let's add another one before it. Li. And this one's just going to say user. And then we'll use PHP. And let's echo back the value that's in the session for username. And let's make sure that in case there's not a value there, let's just put nothing. And then let's close our li tag. All right, so let's save the file and let's try that. Let's go back into our project. Here I am on login.php. You can just navigate directly to that page. You see it says user up here and there's no user. Now let's type in a username, John Doe. I'll click submit. It redirects me to the staff login page and now my user is John Doe. If I go back, login.php, let's try Jane Doe. Submit. Now my user is Jane Doe, right? And it's always going to be that. As I browse around my site, it still remembers Jane Doe on every single page. It's stored up here. Now it's not having to go make a trip to the database to find out that user's name. It's just getting it out of the session file, right? The request was sent in. PHP saw that there was a session identifier sent in with the request as a cookie. It went and found the file, opened it up, got all the data values out of it so they were ready for us to use. Let's make a logout function as well that will unset these values. Let's just I'm going to take this line here, again in my staff header, and let's just duplicate it. But this time, instead of staff index, we're going to make it staff logout.php. We'll label it as logout. Okay, so clicking this link, let's go back here and just see that link real quick. Let's go back to list. Now you'll see it says logout here, right? So clicking logout will take me to my logout page. And before I click it, let me just show you what it does. All it does is bring up initialize.php, so we have our sessions available to us, and then it calls unset on that session username. It just unsets the current value and then redirects us back to the login page. Makes sense. When we log out, you want to log back in again. So it logs us out and sends us back to that initial page again. Let's try it. Let's click log out. Now I'm logged out. Notice that there's no user here anymore, and I'm back on the login page. I can try another one. John Doe. Submit. Now there's a user. Click log out. Now there's not a user anymore. See how that works? It's just setting a value inside that session file and then unsetting it. It's time for another challenge assignment. Your challenge is to add status messages to the application. In the previous movie, we used sessions to store frequently used information, like the username. Another good use for sessions is to store information that needs to persist after a redirect takes place. Remember, a redirect is telling the browser to make a fresh request. It's a useful technique to be able to store status messages in the session, then perform a redirect, and then retrieve the message after the redirect to let the user know what just happened. So to make this work, I want you to go into the staff area, into both staff subjects and in staff pages. And on the new.php, edit.php, and delete.php pages, where we actually make changes to the database, once a change takes effect and we do a redirect, you want to store a status message right before the redirect. For example, when we're creating a new subject record, you would store a message like, the subject was created successfully. That gets stored in the session, then the redirect takes place, and now we have that message stored in the database so that we can display it to the user and show them that the subject was created successfully. One good way to display these status messages is to just make it so that all of the staff area pages are already equipped to display status messages if they exist. So we're going to want to make it so that any page is able to display the status messages, regardless of where we redirect them to. That means that we're going to check and see if the status message is present. If it is, we'll retrieve it and display it. And then after we're done displaying it, we're done with the message. So we can delete the status message from the session. We don't need it anymore. It just needs to survive through that redirect. Spend a few minutes trying it on your own. See how you do. In the next movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. In this movie, I'll show you how I solved the challenge assignment and added status messages to our application. Let's begin by looking at it in action to see what it looks like. So if you weren't clear on exactly what it looks like, here's the way I decided to do it. So I went to subjects. Now I could create a new subject, but instead I'm just going to edit a subject for now. I'm going to click on commercial. I'll click edit, and I could change its visibility or whatever, or I could just click edit. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is to actually edit the data in the database by clicking edit. And as a result, you see it redirected me to the show page, and I get a message here that says the subject was updated successfully. All right, let's take a look to see how we do that. So the first thing I did was I went into subjects, and I went to new.php, and I said, all right, let's find the spot where the new record is created, right? That's here, insert subject. And if it is created successfully, then we redirect the user to the show page. So right before we do that, we want to store this message in the session. So it's going to store a message that says the subject was created successfully. So I did that for the new page, and then I did the same thing for subjects edit.php. I found the spot where the subject gets updated, and then I added a message for the subject was updated successfully. I did the same thing for delete. I found the spot where we're deleting the subject, and right before we do a redirect, I added in a message to the session. And then I did the same thing for pages, for new, for edit, and for delete. Exactly the same. Okay, so that sets the message, make sure that there's a message that's stored there, but now we need to actually display the message after the redirect. To do that, I added a couple of functions. The first one I'm going to show you is down here. It's called display session message. And I want to just be able to call this function, and I want it to handle all the business of displaying the session message. The first thing it does is it calls another function, get and clear session message. What this does is it checks to see if there's a message set, and if it's not equal to nothing, if it's not an empty string, and if there is, it gets that value, assigns it to a variable just as a placeholder, then it calls unset on the message, so the message now goes away, it's not in the session anymore, we're done with it, and then it returns that value, right? So it gets the current value, unsets it, returns the current value. So that value then gets set here. If that value is not blank, then I take that message and I wrap it in some HTML, making sure that I call HTML special chars on it so that it's safe for HTML. And then that value would be output in the code. I could just echo that value. So display session message is the magical function that I need. So once I had that, I went over to the staff header so that every single page in the entire staff area would automatically have this code. And right after the navigation, I added it in. Echo back whatever results you get. Now, if there are no results, if there's nothing in the session, I'll get nothing back. So it won't echo anything at all. But if there is, then it'll drop that code in there right below the navigation, right before the rest of the page content. This is a good way to make sure that it's on all of the staff pages, to put it right here in the header. And then the very last thing I did was I wanted to be able to style that. You'll remember that I just put in a div with an ID of message. So I wanted to add a style to staff.css down here, and I just gave it some color to it. I basically just made a big blue box around it so that it would have the message displayed inside the blue box. And that's it. That's the steps that it took. The end result looks something like this. Now we have a system for displaying status messages in our staff area. And we can use it anytime there's a redirect and we need to be able to maintain some kind of a message to tell the user what just took place. Another example of where we're going to use this is when we log in and log out. Once the user logs in, we're going to redirect them to the menu, and we want to say, you logged in successfully. And same thing when we click log out. We'll log them out, we'll redirect them. We also want to send a message that says, you were logged out successfully. But we'll learn about log in and log out in the next chapter, where we learn about user authentication. In this chapter, we will learn how to regulate access to certain pages by requiring that a user first provide a username and a password. This process is called user authentication because we're verifying the identity of a user. An authentic user should know the username and the password. Let's begin by getting an overview of user authentication. User authentication is essential in any modern web application because they almost always have some kind of password protected area. Maybe it's a content management system where staff or admins are able to update content that the public sees. That's the case in our application that we're building. Or it might be that there's a VIP area or a member-only area, an area dedicated to certain customers or to paying users. In all those cases, we would want to protect those pages so that you have to have a username and password to be able to see the content that's there. And it's important to do it right because if we make mistakes, they can be extremely costly. So it's important to learn the right way to do user authentication. It's also important to recognize that the development choices we make have major security impact. Security and development are closely intertwined topics. So I want to begin with an analogy that can help us to explain how user authentication works. I think this analogy will help you to hold it in your head. Imagine that you're going to be purchasing tickets for a concert or an event. You then go to pick up the tickets, you wait in line, you show your ID, and they let you in. They also stamp your hand as you're going in the door, making it clear that you've been allowed into the concert. Now, you can go into the event. You can also move around into different rooms, go in and out, and all the time they know you've given your ticket already and you're allowed to be there because you have a hand stamp that says so. If you wash away the hand stamp, then you lose your access. Well, it works the same way with our pages. The admin is going to create a user in the database. That's like purchasing tickets for a concert. At that point, we have the ability to attend, even though we haven't attended yet. Then when the user comes to the site, they log in via login form. The application authenticates the user by confirming that their username and password are valid. When the user requests the additional password protected pages, well, that's like showing your hand stamp. Because you have that hand stamp, we know that you're allowed to be there. And then finally, when a user logs out, it's like washing away the hand stamp. It essentially says that at that point, you're no longer allowed to be there and you would need a new ticket, or in this case, to visit the login page in order to get back in again. Now that we have the big picture, let's walk through each of these steps in a bit more detail. To start with, the admin is going to need to create a user in the database. That's an essential first step, right? We need to know who the authenticated users are who should have access. And when they do that, they're going to need to also add a password for that user. It is essential that passwords always be encrypted. You should never, ever, ever have passwords stored as plain text in your database. It's important not just for protecting your users on your site, but for other sites as well, because users often reuse passwords. And if your security was ever compromised and that database data was ever, pulled out by a hacker, then the hacker would have access to those people's usernames and passwords. And they could try them on other websites and see if they work there. And that's happened many, many times in the past. So always, always encrypt passwords. Then the user is going to log in via a login form. The application is going to search the database for that username. And then if the username is found, the way that we'll be able to tell whether the password matches the encrypted password is not by decrypting the password, but instead by encrypting the login password, the one that they're trying to use. We'll encrypt it using the same form of encryption, and if we use that same algorithm with the same password input, we should get the same encrypted result coming out of it. So we can just compare the encrypted results to make sure that they match. Same input should equal the same output. If the passwords match, then it's going to set some kind of value in the session. We talked about sessions in the last chapter. It's going to somehow indicate that this user ID has been authenticated, and then it will grant them access to the site. It will give them some kind of a post-login page. When they come back and ask for additional pages that require password protection, the first thing the application is going to do is check to see whether or not that indication, that hand stamp or user ID is in the session data. If it's there, then they can have the page, no problem. But if not, we're going to redirect them to the login form and force them to provide their username and password. And then, of course, when the user logs out, it's like washing away their hand stamp. That means that we're going to have to erase that user ID that we've stored in the session, and they will no longer have access. Any password protected page they ask for would redirect them back to the login page. Now that we've walked through the process of user authentication, let's start building it in our application. In the last movie, you'll recall that the first step in user authentication is to add a person's credentials, or their username and password, to the database. To do that, we first need a database table that can store those credentials. The SQL command we need to do this is create table. Then we provide the table name, and then in parentheses, the column definitions. You can see here I have a primary key of ID. Then I have columns for first name, last name, email, username, and hashed password. All of those are going to be of type varchar and have a length of 255 characters because they're just going to store strings in them. Now, first name, last name, and email are really just conveniences, so I really know who this person is in real life and how I can reach them. The most important part of the credentials are the last two, their username and their password. Notice that I don't call it just password though, I call it hashed underscore password. Hash is another name for an encrypted string. So this is a encrypted password, and I've named it that to remind me of that fact, that it's always going to be encrypted. It's not a plain text password, it's an encrypted password. You may also remember that in part 1 of this course, we talked about indexes and how indexes can allow you to look up information quickly based on a certain column. And there's always an index on the primary key, and we talked about how to add indexes on a foreign key. It's also a good idea here to have an index on username. If you think about it, we're going to be looking up admins by their username whenever someone logs in. We're not going to be looking for them by their ID. We're going to be saying, hey, admins table, do you have a user with a username that matches this login? So in order to enable that process to go as quickly as possible, it's a good idea to add an index on that column. This will just allow us to look up things by the username very quickly. Let's try adding the admins table to our database. The first step is to log into MySQL from the command line. You can see I've got here MySQL-U, and I'm using my web user. That's the user that I created that has access to the Globe Bank database, globe_bank. And I'm using a -p option because I want to type in a password. So I'll type return, it'll ask for my password. Then once I type that in, I'll be inside MySQL, and I can say show tables. You can see that I have just my subjects and my pages table. So now we need that admins table. In the exercise files, you'll find that definition that we just created, or you can go back and pause and copy it down. I'm just going to copy this first part, and I'll paste that in, and that created my table. And then let's do the second one, which is to add that index, alter table admins. We'll paste that one in, and it says OK. So now let's do show tables, and you'll see I have my admins table. If I say show fields from admins, you'll see it comes up and it shows me the different columns that it created. Now that I have an admins table, I just need a way for staff users, people who already have access to the staff area, to be able to add new users to authorize them. So we'll tackle that next. It's time for another challenge assignment. Your challenge is to create pages in the staff area to manage the contents of the admins table we just created. Much of this challenge is a review of work that we did in part 1 of this course. There, we created pages to manage the contents of the subjects and pages tables by using PHP to perform similar CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. You'll find yourself writing code similar to this over and over when developing web applications, and you should have these skills ready whenever they're needed. Let's walk through the details of the admin management. For the admin CRUD pages, you're going to put them all in a single directory called admins. That'll keep them organized. And you're going to have 5 pages. Index.php will show a list of all the admins. Show would allow you to see details of a particular admin. New would be a web form to allow you to create new admins in the database. Edit is a web form to allow you to update existing admins in the database. And delete would allow us to delete admins. And don't forget, you'll also want to put a link on the main staff area menu page to allow you to get to all of this admin management. We'll also need to have queries that will allow us to use PHP to connect to the database to perform those operations. So we'll have one for finding all admins, for finding a particular admin, and then one for inserting, updating, and deleting an admin. Don't forget, you'll also need to have validations. It's important that we have validations to make sure that the data that goes into our database meets our requirements. Let's walk through those requirements together. The first name should be at least 2 characters long and have a maximum of 255 characters. The last name would be the same, a minimum of 2, a maximum of 255. The email address should not be blank and should have a maximum of 255 characters. It should also be of a valid format. You should already have a helper that will allow you to confirm that an email address is in a valid email format. And then you're going to check that the username is between 8 and 255 characters. And we also want to make sure that the username is unique. We do not have a helper method for that. You may remember that we had one to check and see whether our page name is unique. You can modify that and make it work for your username. And then we need to talk about our password. Don't worry about encrypting the password yet. We're going to talk about that in a moment. For now, on our form and in our validations, the attribute we use is going to be called password, not hashed password. That's going to be the encrypted version that gets stored later. For now, we're going to be working with password, and it's going to be plain text. Once it passes its validations, then we'll encrypt it and convert it into the hashed password. The plain text password needs to be at least 12 characters long. It should also have 1 uppercase letter, 1 lowercase letter, 1 number, and 1 symbol. This ensures that we get a good, strong password. I'm a firm believer that for a sensitive area like our admin, where we have the ability to update all sorts of site content, that we need to have good, strong passwords that are at least 12 characters long and include a variety of characters. We're also going to add another field to our form, which is confirm password. This is a common feature because passwords are typically blanked out so that when you type in them, you see bullets by using a password input instead of the actual plain text. Having confirm password allows us to make sure that we didn't accidentally mistype that password. It's just a sanity check. So we're going to check and make sure that the confirm password attribute in our associative array is not blank and that the value matches the value for password. Again, we're doing that on the plain text version. We're not working with encryption just yet. Try implementing these features on your own. You'll find it's a really good review of your skills. In the next movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. Hopefully you did well with the challenge assignment and you were able to build the admin management pages in PHP. In this movie, I'm going to show you the solution that I came up with. The first thing that I did was on my main staff area page on index.php, I just added a new link right here to admins. And so that's going to go to staff admins index.php, and that's going to allow me to get to my admin management. Let's take a look at that index.php page. It's inside the admins directory that keeps them all organized. You notice I have subjects and pages down here, keeps them all sort of namespaced together. And then inside index.php, you'll see that I'm calling a query function that we'll look at in a moment called find all admins. It gives me back a set of admins, a record set. And then I'm going to loop through those as a table and use MySQL fetch association to pull each admin out and display it as a list. And then each one of those items in the list is also going to have a link for viewing it, for editing it, and deleting it. So if we want to view it, that would be the show.php page. So on the show.php page, you can see it's getting the URL attribute for ID. It's finding the admin by that ID. And then down here, it's just going to display the basic information, the first name, the last name, the email, and the username. We don't display the password because that's eventually going to be encrypted and that's kind of meaningless. So there's no reason to show it there. Let's take a look at new.php. That's the form that allows us to create a new password. If it's a post request, we'll process the form, but if not, we're going to get the values ready to display a blank form. Let's do that first. Let's look at the form itself. First name, last name, username, and email are all just text fields. That's all pretty straightforward. But notice that I've got now an input of type password whose name is password and an input of type password whose name is confirm password, right? See how that works? Even though there's not a column in the database for password or confirm password, my form values are going to include it. I've also got a note down here that just says that password should be at least 12 characters long and include 1 uppercase letter, lowercase letter, number, and symbol. That way our users will know right from the start what the requirements are for this password. Once those values are submitted, we'll just add them into our associative array here and pass them into insert admin. It'll take care of all the business for inserting the admin, including the validations. Once we get back a result from it, you'll see that it uses MySQL insert ID to get the new ID. It will send us to the show.php page to be able to see that admin. And we're also using that session message that we created earlier to provide a message after the redirect that the admin has been created. The edit.php page works very similar, the only difference being that there is an existing ID, so we make sure that we find that admin by the ID before we display the form. And delete is pretty self-explanatory. It just takes the ID and then deletes the admin. Let's take a look at those query functions. So right below all of my other query functions, I added some new ones. I have one that's find all admins, select all from admins, ordering by last name and then first name. You notice that I just have last name, ascending, ASC, comma, first name, ASC. So that'll keep them sorted. We could also sort it by username if we wanted to, but I decided to sort it by last name. Then we have find admin by ID. That should be pretty straightforward and familiar to you now. We have our validation, which we'll come back to in a moment. Then we have insert admin. It's going to call those validations, and if it passes validations, we're going to have insert into admins. Now notice here this line on 398, where I'm taking the value of password, the value that passed validations, the plain text password that was passed in, and I'm assigning it to hashed password. Right here is where we're eventually going to encrypt the password. For now, it's not encrypting it. It's just a placeholder. We'll come back and talk about that in the next movie. For now, it just takes the plain text password, assigns it to hash password, and that's what gets put into the database. So we'll put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. And then we have something similar for update admin. It calls the validations. If it passes, then we assign the plain text password to hashed password. We call update admins, and we update the database with the new data. And then, of course, delete admin just deletes an admin from the database based on the ID. First name, we validate that it's not blank and that it's got a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 255. We do the same thing for last name. Email, we make sure it's not blank. We make sure it has a maximum of 255. And then we call this helper that we already had in our validation functions file called has valid email format. So that'll check and make sure it's a valid email format. For the username, we're going to check and make sure it's between 8 and 255 characters. And then we're going to call another helper has unique username. That's a new validation function that I created. It's almost identical to has unique page menu name. You can use that as a starting point. It just takes a username and checks the admins table to see whether or not there's a username that matches. And it works in both cases, whether this is a new record or whether this is an existing record. And then we've got our validations on the password and confirm password. Now these are sort of virtual attributes, right? They're not actually in the database as columns, but we still can check them in the associative array. Password should not be blank. It also should be a minimum of 12 characters. And I'm using pregmatch with some regular expressions to check and make sure that it has an uppercase letter, that it has a lowercase letter, a number, and a symbol, or something which is not a uppercase, lowercase, or number, right? It's the opposite of that, or white space as well. Make sure that it has something that doesn't meet those criteria. That's what the not in front of this means in regex. So that'll check and make sure that all of those are there, it meets those requirements. And then I've got one for confirm password as well. It checks to make sure that it's not blank. And then here you'll see that it checks to make sure that the password matches the confirmed password. So that makes sure that they must match and that there wasn't a simple mistake that was made. If we go into Firefox, we can see the end results. We'll go into the admin area. You can see there's a list of them. There's none in there at the moment, so there's nothing to see. And we can click Create New Admin, and we'll get an idea of what the form looks like that we would normally be submitting. Now, I'm not going to create any in there yet because we still haven't created that one part of our code that will actually hash the password. We need to talk about how to do that before we start creating admins because we want those passwords to be encrypted in our database. In this movie, we're going to learn how to encrypt passwords with PHP. The most important rule about passwords is never store them as plain text in the database. You always want to encrypt them. If they're in plain text, then anyone with access to the database would have access to every user's password. That could be hackers who are stealing your database, or it could be authorized users, such as site administrators or employees who have database access. They would all have the potential to know all users' passwords. Even a database backup that your ISP makes for you, or a hard drive that doesn't get completely wiped before being sold or discarded, has serious potential for leaking passwords. And it's not just theoretical. This happens all the time. When it happens, it's not just your site security you put at risk because many users use the same username and password on multiple sites. So if you disclose their password on your site, chances are you've now given away their password on another site somewhere else. So please, as a favor to all of us other website developers, always encrypt your passwords. Not only are we going to be encrypting them, we're going to be using one-way encryption. It won't be possible for anyone to decrypt the password and get the original string, including us. This works because of the principle that the same inputs to the same hashing or encryption algorithm will always result in the same output. It works like this. We take the password, we encrypt it, and we store the encrypted string in the database. Then, when a user tries to log in, we take their attempted password, we pass it into the same hashing or encryption algorithm, and we see if the output, the encrypted string that results, is the same thing as what we've stored. If the encrypted strings match, then we know that the input must have been correct. If the encrypted strings are different, then we know the input wasn't correct. It also matters what type of encryption algorithm we use. We've already said that we want a one-way algorithm. We also want one that's a strong algorithm that's resistant to attempts to break it. And also a slow one. Not so slow that our users notice, but slow enough to deter rapid-fire guessing using brute force techniques. An industry standard for encrypting passwords is bcrypt, which is based on the Blowfish cipher. And that's what's built into PHP by default, and it's what we'll be using. Beginning with PHP version 5.5, there are a number of password functions that are included to help us with this process. Before that, developers had to create their own functions to perform these tasks, and it was easy for them to make mistakes or not follow best practices. So the PHP developers decided to give people best practices built into some functions, and it's been a huge help, and it's very easy to use too. There's a function called password_hash, and you pass it in the plain text password that you want to use, and you tell it what algorithm you want to use. There's a constant password_default in all capital letters built into PHP, which goes with whatever the recommended default password is for PHP. At the moment, that password is password_bcrypt. So at the moment, it doesn't matter whether you pass in that second argument as password_default or password_bcrypt. They both point to the same place. You get the bcrypt algorithm. But if you use default, then in the future, it might change to something else. So just be aware of that. The bcrypt also has some options that you can pass in, such as a cost parameter. This has to do with how many times the bcrypt algorithm cycles as it's doing its thing. It just makes it a little bit slower, can make it a little bit more complex. 10 is the default value, and that's a good value. So you typically don't need to change that, but you can if you know you need it. Password hash also does some more advanced things for you, like automatically generating a salt value, things like that that you can read more about in the documentation if you're curious. But using it is really just this simple. We pass in our plain text password and we ask it to encrypt it. Now, when we want to take an attempted password, we could go and pass it back into password hash again. But there's an even easier way to do it. We can use password verify. Password verify, and then the first argument is the attempted password. The second one is the encrypted string, the hashed password. The reason it's better to do it this way is because there's some important meta information at the beginning of that encrypted string that tells PHP what algorithm was used, what the cost parameters were, and what the seed value was used at the beginning as well. So those need to all be passed in. So password verify will take all those into account and use those when it's verifying the password to see if it matches. And it will simply return true or false. So it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Password hash returns an encrypted string. Password verify returns true or false. It couldn't be easier. Let's start by adding password hash to our existing application. So you'll remember in the last movie, when we're inserting an admin, we pass the validations, and we do that using a plain text password. And then down here, we have that plain text password, which we're just assigning to the variable hash password. And then hash password is what actually gets put into the database. So what we want is just to encrypt this string right here. So I'm going to put parentheses around it, and let's call password_hash. And then we need to tell it what algorithm we want to use. So if we just type password_default, that would work, or we could do bcrypt. Either one, doesn't matter. Let's put bcrypt on ours, and I'm going to now take that line and copy it, because in addition to when we create an admin, down here when we update an admin, we have the same thing. We passed validations. We want to take that plain text password now and hash it using bcrypt. We'll come up with a hashed password, which will then get stored in the database. All right, let's save that file and let's go try it out. Here I am in my staff area in the admins. Let's click create new admin and let's create our new admin. I'm going to call this one John, last name public, and username John Q public, email john@nowhere.com, password. Now remember, it has to be 12 characters and include at least one uppercase letter, lowercase letter, number, and symbol. The instructions are there at the bottom. So I'm going to do that. And then we have to retype it again. And I'll click create admin. It says admin created. Let's take a look to see what happened. Let's go take a look in our database. Here I am, MySQL-U web user-P globe bank. Put in my password there. And let's do select all from admins. And there it is. You can actually see that hash password there. If we do select, and let's just do ID, comma, hashed password, you'll be able to see it a little better. So there's what it looks like. So some of this is the meta information that needs to be there. That's what gets passed back in when we verify, along with the encrypted string. You don't need to worry about how bcrypt functions or how you work with all this meta information. PHP handles all of that for you, which is really nice. In the next movie, we can modify our login page to use password verify and figure out whether our attempted password matches this encrypted string. In this movie, we'll learn to authenticate user access. In other words, we'll write the code that will allow a user to log in with a username and a password. Before we dive in and look at the code, I'm going to add a new file. It's in the exercise files. It's called authfunctions.php. I'm going to put it in my private directory. This is a place where I'm going to store all of the functions related to authorizing a user. It'll just keep them separate from everything else. So let's go into our code. And the first thing I need to do is go to initialize.php and make sure that the authorization functions are also required. Let's just add that right here, authfunctions.php. Okay, so now that I have my authorization functions, let's take a look at what's in them. You see I have simply one function here called login_admin. And when I pass it in an associative array for the admin, this admin object that we're working with, it's going to take care of all the business for logging in that user, basically giving them a hand stamp. It also does some nice things like regenerate the session ID. This is a nice security measure that protects against something called session fixation. You don't need to worry about what that is, but if you just call session regenerate ID, it makes sure that the user gets a new session ID anytime they log in. And then it's going to take that admin ID and it's going to store it as admin ID, and it's also going to set the time to the last login. That way we can also have that available to know what the last login time is. We can expire someone after a certain point if we want, for example. Now, in login.php, we had already created this file in the staff area, so staff login.php. You can see I'm also storing the username just as a convenience here. I'm going to also take that out of there and move it into auth functions as well. So we'll just store the username here, but the username is not username anymore. It's now going to be admin username. All right, so we'll take that value and we'll just store it there for convenience. Okay, so now we have a function here, login admin. All we have to do is call that function when we're ready to log in an admin. All right, so let's jump back over here to login.php and I'll just add that in as a placeholder for now. Now, before we just log in the admin, we need to check their username and password, right? That's the purpose of this. We've already got a form here. They can submit the form. If it's a post request, then we'll try and process it. So the first thing we need to do is validate the form data, right? Make sure that the username and password was submitted. So let's do a simple validation here, is blank on username. And if it is blank, then we're going to add to our, you can see it up above, we've already initialized the errors array. So we're just going to add a new item to it, which is going to say username cannot be blank. Okay, that'll keep it nice and simple. I'm just going to write up here validations. And let's copy that. Let's do the same thing for the password. So that'll make sure that they've given us some value. We'll say that username and password cannot be blank. Assuming that we didn't get any errors from that, if empty our errors array, then we want to try to process the form. So let's put a note here that says, if there were no errors, try to log in. Now, if there were errors, then the rest of the form will just render, right? And actually displays those errors right here at the top of the form. So we don't need to do anything else if there were errors. But If there were no errors, then let's try and log in. How do we log in? Well, we know we want to first find the admin. So in order to find the admin, we need to have something to find this admin by, which is the username. In our query functions, we had find admin by ID. We need another version that finds it by the username. So I'm going to copy all of that and use it as a starting point for find admin by username. And the value we pass in is going to be the username. It's going to select all from admins where username, type it correctly, is the same value, username. And limit 1, it'll then query it, it'll see if it gets a result back, and it'll return that admin. Works exactly the same, we're just finding by username instead of finding by ID. So let's save that file, and let's switch back over to login.php, and we're going to use that same thing with the username value we have. So we may or may not get back a record. If we get back a record, then we want to try and log in, right? So if we get back a record, else we did not get back a record, which means no username was found. All right, we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, let's go about logging in. We know how to do that with password verify. We talked about that in the last movie. We're going to use password verify. We're going to pass in the attempted password, and then we're going to use the encrypted password, which we just looked up, right? It's in that associative array for the admin. It's called hashed_password. So we'll pass those in, and password verify will come back with either true or false. It'll do all the heavy lifting for us and just return back true. If it returns true, then we can say password matches. Else, we'll say username found, but password does not match. So if the password matches, we know what we want to do. We want to do this bit right here. I'm going to copy this and just move it up here, paste it in. We want to log in the admin and redirect them. Now, if the username is found but the password does not match, then we want to return back an error to them. And I can use that same errors array to do that. Errors. And I could put a message here that says login was unsuccessful. What you don't want to do is indicate that the password failed. You don't want to say, hey, the username was right, but the password was wrong. We just want to tell them it was unsuccessful. We don't want to tell them why. And the same thing is true down here. No username found, login was unsuccessful. We want the exact same message, regardless of whether the problem was the username or the password. It makes hacking a lot harder. I'm going to go ahead and actually take that whole string and just come up here and add a new line here. Actually, let's do it right. If admin matches, then let's say login failure message equals, and I'll use that string. And then I can come down here and just replace that string with login failure message and login failure message. And that will ensure that they're the same. Let me just make a note here. Using one variable ensures that message is the same. That's why we're doing it. Okay, so let's just double check our work for typos. Everything looks okay. Let's try it all out. Let's save this file. Let's go into Firefox. And you'll remember that the page we want to load is staff/login.php. So here I am at my login page. Let's try just putting in some gibberish without a password and hit submit. Password cannot be blank. Let's try some gibberish down there. Submit. So we got an error. Login failure message on line 39, undefined variable. Login failure message. I need to just move this up. There we go. So if the errors are empty, then we'll set the login failure message. Let's try that again. Put some gibberish in here. Submit. Okay, so now we have that variable available for both of them. Login was unsuccessful. So now let's try our real one. This requires that you remember what you typed in. I had John Q public for a username and my password. There we go. Now click submit. Now I'm logged in. And how do I know I was logged in? Because it redirected me. The only way I would have gotten redirected, the only way I would have not seen the login form again is if I got through this step where password verify came back true. Then it logged me in, and you can see one of those steps when it logged me in was it also set my username, and I also have a username set here. So my login did work. I was authenticated. So now we've learned the two most important parts. We learned how to store the encrypted string in the database, and we know how to use password verify so that we can log in and match an attempted string against that stored encrypted version. In the previous movie, we learned how to authenticate a user. That is, how they can log in with their username and the password. However, none of the pages that we have require that authorization right now. They all just let anyone view them who wants to. What we need to do is add some code that will check to see whether the user is currently authenticated before it lets them have the page, to require that they have the authorization. To do this, I'm going to add a couple more functions to our authfunctions.php that we added in the last movie. This code is included in the exercise files if you want to get it from there. I'm going to paste them in. The first function is logged in. And is logged in is just going to check and see, is the current user logged in? And the way it does that is it looks for that hand stamp, that ID that we put into the session. It checks to see if that value is set. If it exists, then we know the user is logged in. It's in their session. If not, then they're not logged in. It's that simple. Now, this just tells us if they're logged in or not. I've got another function down here called require login. Require login is going to call that first function to see whether they're logged in or not. And if they're not, it's going to redirect them to the login page. So the two functions are going to work together. Now I keep them separate because is logged in can be used in other cases as well. Maybe I want to show a certain link or something depending on whether the user is logged in or not, right? I don't necessarily want to redirect them to another page. I just want to have some conditional logic on my site. Is logged in allows me to do that. Require logged in is the one that does the redirecting. Now, another point that I wanted to mention here is part of the reason we use admin_ID as the hand stamp for this user is that that value can then be used if we need to look up that user's record. Now, we stored their username in the session here, but for example, if we wanted their first name or last name for some reason, right, we could go to the database using this stored ID and look up that admin record. But just simply having that value set is going to be enough for them to be considered logged in. Okay, so now I have my functions here. Now we need to make use of them. So how do we do that? Let's go, for example, to our menu page to start with, index.php, right? You shouldn't be able to see this index page unless you're logged in. So when I call initialize.php, that loads in all my functions, including those auth functions. So all I have to do right here at the top of the page is add a line in my PHP code that's going to call this function right here, require login. That's it. Right here at the top of the page, require login with the semicolon. Let's save it. And let's go back and let's try it out. Let's go into Firefox and let's just reload this page. And I am able to see the page because I am logged in. Now, if I click log out, it doesn't actually log me out yet. We haven't written that code yet. We're going to have to come back and do that in a moment. For now, as a temporary workaround, let's just add a little bit of code here, PHP, and let's unset that value. So that's going to be the superglobal session admin ID. Let's close those PHP tags. Okay, and we can even take away the require login for a moment. We'll just comment that out. So all it does is when it loads this page, it unsets the admin ID. Let's come back. Let's reload this page. Okay, so now the admin ID is gone. I'm going to take that line back out. Now let's put back in the require login. Let's go and reload the page again. And look at that. It didn't give me the page. It redirected me back. Now ignore the fact that this still has the username up there. That's separate. We just did a little hack here just to remove the hand stamp, that admin ID. And when we did, it took us to the login page. So that's all we need to do is this one line, require login. So if we go to each and every one of our pages, we can add that in. Now we don't want to add it to our login page, right? That page doesn't require being logged in. Log out could use it, but I don't think it's really necessary to check and make sure someone's logged in before you get a logged out page. But our other pages definitely do need it. So let's go, for example, to our admin area. And at the top of this page, let's do it before we find the admins. Remove the PHP tags here. We're going to require login. And let's go to new. And right after we initialize, require login. Show.php, right after we initialize, require login. And edit.php, require login, and delete. We don't even find the ID before we do this. The very first thing is just check and make sure the user's logged in. All right, let's just close all those up. And we did that for admins. Let's do the same thing for our subjects. Let's start with delete.php and edit.php, index.php. I'll do it right here. And new.php. and show.php. Okay, let's do the same thing for our pages. Index.php. I did this in the wrong order. Let's do delete next. Then let's do edit and new and show. Okay, so let's close all those up, make sure they're all saved, and then we can test it out. Let's go here and let's just try, we click on our menu. You see we get back to our login.php. Let's try staff and let's try subjects/index.php. Look at that, sent me back to the login page. Let's try staff pages index.php. Nope, sent me back to the login. Every time it wants me to be logged in. Now let's go and actually log in again. That's for me, John Q Public, my password. Click submit. Now I'm logged in. I'm able to see the menu. I can see the subjects. I can see the pages, and I can see the admins. Now I have the ability to move around in that password protected area. And it requires that I have that authorization before it will give me those pages. Now that we've learned how to authenticate a user and how to have pages that require that authorization, we need to learn how to remove the authorization or to log out a user. We already have a placeholder page for logging out, logout.php, and we even have a link for it at the top of our page. But if we click that, it doesn't actually log us out. We stay logged in because it's not removing the hand stamp, that admin ID that we stored in the session. It's just unsetting session username, which was just a convenience that we had earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to authfunctions.php, and right here below login admin, I'm going to add a new function called logoutAdmin. This is also included in the exercise files if you want to get it from there. And it's going to do the exact opposite of logging in the user. It's going to unset all of those session IDs, one for admin ID, last login, and username. So it handles all the business of logging a user out. I also have another optional choice here. You could completely destroy the session if you wanted. Now, if you need the session for something else and you're storing things in it, you wouldn't want to do that. Most important part is just that we removed this line right here, that the admin ID is removed because that's the thing we use to determine whether a user is authorized or not. So now I can just call logoutAdmin from my page logout.php. I don't need any of this anymore. And that's it. That's all there is to it. Just go to the page, log out the admin, and redirect them back to the login page. Let's save it and let's try it out. Here we are back on our page. I'm logged in. I'm able to see the admins. Let's reload that page, right? I have access. Click log out. Now I'm back at the login page. And if I click menu, right, I don't get anything. I keep getting the login page. I'm not allowed to see any of those pages anymore. If I click the back arrow, right, doesn't matter how many pages I go back, right, it doesn't let me see those pages. Let's try subjects index.php. Right, I get the login page again. Once I log in, John Q Public, and I log in, now I'm able to see it. I'm able to move around, see the different pages. As soon as I log out, now that hand stamp is removed, and once again, I don't have access to those pages. So we've now completed all of the major steps. We're able to store an encrypted password in the database. Then we have a login form. The user can attempt to log in, and we handle the cases when the login fails. If we're able to successfully go to the database and match the username and the password, then we log the user in and give them a hand stamp so they can move around different pages. They can't see those pages if they don't have that stamp. And last of all, they have a log out button, which allows them to essentially wash away that hand stamp, to no longer be authorized to see any of those pages. We've almost completed our discussion of user authentication. We've been able to store encrypted passwords in the database, to have users log in and check to see if a password matches. We're able to protect pages to make sure users are logged in, and we're able to log out. So what topic is there left? Well, there's minor detail in the fact that we don't always want to update the password in the database. And I want us to address that in this movie. Let me demonstrate to explain. Here I am logged into the staff area. I'm going to click on admins. If we want to create a new admin, we know that we always want to provide a password when we're creating that admin. And it is required. Our validations require it, or it won't let us create this admin. However, when we go to edit a user, you'll notice that we don't see their password here. Their password is left blank. It's encrypted in the database, so there's no way we could display the password to them here. But what if we wanted to make a change to this record? What if we wanted to edit the admin and we did not want to change their current password? So let's say that maybe the user got married and their last name changed. Or maybe we just need to update their email address to be somewhere.com. I can't submit this record because the validations will prevent it from being saved because the password and confirm password are required. But I don't necessarily know what this password is, and I don't necessarily want to set it to a new password that might keep the user from logging out. So we need to make this optional. We need to make it so the password is not necessarily required when I'm editing the admin. Now, if a password is there, then we want to perform our validations. We want to make sure that it has 12 characters and it has uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols in it. So we do still want those validations there. We don't want to just skip the validations altogether. So what we need to do is write some code inside update admin that'll decide whether or not the password should be required. So what I'm thinking is that we'll add a line here that will just say, was the password sent? And we'll check. If it's not blank, then we'll know it was sent. So if it was sent, then it's required, right? That's the logic here. If the password was sent, then it's required. If it was not sent, then it's not required. We're going to assume that it's okay, and we're going to leave it alone, and we're not going to actually do the update. So that means that down here in this code for hashed password, we're going to put a line here that says if password sent, then we're going to include in the SQL this line to update the hashed password. Otherwise, it'll get omitted. Now notice here that I actually put the username after hashed password. And the reason why that is because there's this comma right here. And I want this still to read correctly. I want to have a comma here, and then no comma after the last one. So by making hash password not the very last item, it allows me to do that. So make sure that it works whether this line is included or not. These still will concatenate together correctly. Okay, so it's not just a matter of checking to see whether the password was sent as to whether updated. The validations also need to consider whether it was sent or not. So what we need to do is use that same technique we used earlier in this course, where we sent an option array into a function to change its behavior, to give it conditional behavior. What we'll do is we'll pass in an option called password required, and I'll set that equal to whatever the value of password sent is. If the password was sent, then it's required, and our validation should check for it. But if it's not sent, then the validations should not check for it. So password sent is going to determine whether or not it's set here. Password required is the name of the option we're going to be using inside our validations. So I'm just going to scroll up to our validations here. And right here, let's add that options array. It's going to be a default to an empty array because it may or may not exist. And then let's set a default value for it. So password required equals whatever the value of options password required was. And if nothing was sent, then it's going to default to true. So that's that PHP 7 operator that sets a default value if none is found. So this will determine whether the password is required. If it's passed in false, then the password's not required. Otherwise, it will default to true. It will be required. So let's just scroll down here, and where we have all of this check for password and confirm password, let's just add a line here that says if password is required, then we're going to do all of this code. Let's grab all of this. Let's just move it up. There we go. So now it's inside this conditional. If the password's required, then perform the validations on it. Otherwise, don't perform those validations. Let's save it and let's try it out. Let's come back over here, and I'm just going to hit edit admin on it. I've changed this from nowhere to somewhere for their email address. Let's click edit admin. Notice it did not run the validations, and it did update the email address, even though I didn't change the password. So the password did not get updated. It's the exact same encrypted hash in the database. So now we've completed user authentication. Now there's a lot more that you could add to this. For example, you might make it so that one user can't necessarily update the records of another user, right? You can only go in and edit records for some users. Maybe the edit button disappears or the delete button disappears unless you are that user or if you have some kind of super admin privileges. There's lots of bells and whistles you can add to this to make it nicer. But the fundamental idea is in place. We have users in our database. We've encrypted their passwords. They can log in by providing the plain text password, and we can compare it against the encrypted version. We can keep them logged in so that they have a privileged status and can view pages which they're authorized for, and then they can log out again. In an earlier chapter, we created a feature that would allow admins to be able to preview content just as the public would see it, but before the content was made visible to the public. And at the time, if you'll remember, we put a note in there that we wanted to come back to this topic once we understood user authentication, so that we could actually make sure that the previewing was authorized by someone actually being logged in. Now that we understand user authentication, we can revisit that topic. The place where we added that preview code is in index.php. Inside the public directory, this is the main page for displaying content to the public, and you can see that we're checking here to see whether or not preview has been set and whether it's been set to true. And if it has, then we're going to allow the user to preview the content. Let's take a look at that. Over here in my staff area, I'm going to find one of my pages that is set to be not visible. I'm going to view it, and then I'll preview it. Now, because I'm previewing, I can see it even before it's set to be visible. And I see it in the public context, I get to preview it. Now, we've also learned about insecure direct object references. And that's actually what we have here, because all it takes is for someone to add this little bit to the URL, preview equals true, and then they'll be able to see this page. No user authentication is required at the moment, and that's bad. So we want to change this. We want to make sure that we check to see whether someone is actually authorized before they're able to use that preview. In order to do that, we need to check and see if the user is logged in. In our authorization functions, authfunctions.php, we had a two-step process for seeing if someone is logged in. We had isLoggedIn as one function and requireLogin as the other one. IsLoggedIn is going to come in useful here because we don't want to require them to be logged in and redirect them here. We could, but instead what we want to do is just ask, are they logged in, right? Just find out the answer, true or false, are they logged in? So I'm just going to copy that. Let's go back here to index.php, and I want to add it here to this conditional statement, right? This is a conditional. We have the condition and then question mark, and then it's either true or false. So what I'm going to do is add it right here. I'm going to put and then is logged in. That's the function I want to call, so I have to have the parentheses after it because it's a function. Now I could put is logged in first, but the simplest thing is just to check and see if we have this variable. That's a faster check than actually going to the session and checking to see whether there's something there. So I'm going to put the fast check first. Are we being asked to preview it first? If so, then check and see if they're logged in, right? That's the second condition. If it's not being asked to preview it, then this condition would just fail and we would never ask this second question at all. So if both of these things evaluate to true, then it will return true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. Let's try it out. Let's save that file. Let's come back over here and let's click preview. Now I'm logged in at the moment and I am able to see it, right? That works great. Now let's close that page up. Let's click log out. Actually, before I do that, let me go ahead and open a new window here. So there's my new window. Now let's go and log out. Now let's go back and let's reload this page. I'm logged out now, and it did not let me see it. When I reloaded it, it redirected me back. It said, nope, sorry, you're not logged in, which is what we would expect to happen when you try to see content that you're not allowed to see. So that's all it takes. We just have to make sure that the user is asking to preview the content and that they're authorized to view the content. And that will make sure we don't have an insecure direct object reference and that only our staff can use our previewing feature. In this chapter, we're going to discuss how to handle nesting of related resources. What do those terms mean? What is a resource and what does it mean for it to be nested? When I use the term resource, I'm referring to a set of data or functionality that's of a single type. So far in our application, we have three things I would consider resources. We have subjects, we have pages, and we have admins. Each one of those is a different type of data. We're storing it in a different table in the database, and there's different functionality related to each one. We actually have PHP functions that allow us to do create, read, update, and delete on each of those three different resources. When I talk about nesting the resources, I'm talking about putting a resource inside another resource so that it's dependent on the resource it sits inside. Most often, when we talk about nesting resources, what we're talking about is one-to-many relationships. And we've seen how we have a one-to-many relationship between our subjects and our pages. Each subject has many pages that belong to it. So the idea here is to take the pages resource and nest it inside the subject resource. Currently, if we looked at our subjects list, you'd see we have a list of all of our subjects, and we have the ability to go in and edit each of those. And then we have a separate area for editing all of our pages. And the pages know what subject they belong to, but it's just one long list of pages that we have to go through and work with. If we nest those, we would instead put the pages as a sub-resource of subjects, so that each page would belong to its subject. Here I've shown them just as a single list so that you can see how each page is indented with a bullet point in front of it underneath each subject. This is the idea of nesting. We don't see a list of just all pages anymore. Now each page belongs to its parent subject. And it can make working with these resources much easier because each page resource now is limited in its scope. It's limited to just thinking about the subject that it belongs to and the other pages that are its siblings, not to all the other pages that belong to other subjects. So in practical terms, what this means is that we're no longer going to have direct access to our pages from our admin area. Instead, we're going to go through the subjects area in order to get to those pages. So we'll still be able to edit all the page content. We'll just need to first pick a subject and then pick a page. It also means that we're going to need to group our pages by subject. There are a number of ways that we can group these or reorganize our code. The important point is that we're no longer going to see a list of all pages, but a list of pages that just belong to a single subject. And once we complete that restructuring, we're also going to need to consider all the previous links and redirects that we'd created, because those are all going to be reviewed and possibly modified to work with our new structure. When we only have 3 resources, it may not seem like it's super necessary to have. But once you start having a more complex website that has 20 or 25 different resources, and those resources relate to each other in this kind of one-to-many way, it can be really handy to take some of those resources and tuck them inside their parent resources to keep them better organized. We're going to begin nesting our resources, that is, putting our pages nested inside the subjects, by first starting out with reorganizing our code a bit so that we list our pages by their subject. Currently, in our staff area, we have a list of our subjects, and separately from that, we have a list of our pages. And each page knows which subject it belongs to. What I want to do is take the pages that belong to a subject. For example, these first 4 pages belong to About Globe Bank. And instead of listing them here on this page, I want to take them and I want to list them with their subject underneath the subject. So I want to click on View for About Globe Bank. We're now seeing details about this subject. And what I want is right here below it to have a list of the pages that belong to this subject. So the only way to see the list of pages is to first choose the subject. So in order to do that, let's first start by going into our staff area, and let's go to index.php in the staff area, and let's just take away that link that we had for pages. So now the only way to get there is this link to subjects. Let's save that, and then let's go into subjects show.php. That's the page we were just looking at. And down here, let's add in a horizontal rule, HR. It's a HTML tag that'll make a line across the bottom, and now below that line is where we're going to put a list of our pages. So how do we get a list of our pages? Well, I want it to look pretty much like the list of pages I've already got, which is pages index.php. So let's go there, and let's grab all of this here, pages listing. Don't want to grab content, but everything else that's inside there, let's grab. Let's copy that. Let's go to show.php, and let's start by just pasting that in. Now let's make a couple of changes here. One is that instead of being an H1 tag for pages, let's make it H2 because we have H1 up at the top already for subject, right? That's up here. So let's make this an H2 tag. We're going to keep this link to a new page. We'll come back to that later. In the list though, we're already listing the current subject and we don't need to do that. We don't need that subject name anymore because that's already on this page. That's a bit redundant. So let's remove those 2 lines there. Okay, so now you'll notice that this page is going through a page set, right? It's iterating through this page set. And back over here on index.php, that page set is up here at the top. Page set is finding all pages. So we could copy that and come back over here to show.php. Let's put it at the top. But you can probably already guess what the problem with that is. Let's go and reload our page. You'll see we're getting a list here, but we're getting a list of all the pages, right? We don't want that. We just want pages that belong to this subject ID. Now we have a function in our query functions that'll help us with that. Let's scroll down here a bit till we get to our pages. We have find all pages, find page by ID, validate the page, insert the page, update the page, delete the page, and then finally find pages by subject ID. That's the one we want. We pass in a subject ID and it returns us just pages for that subject ID. So let's use that instead. Find pages by subject ID, and the subject ID is called ID here, right? That's all it is. So we take that, that'll give us our page set, and then we can iterate through those. Let's go back and take a look, reload the page, and there you go. Subject about Globe Bank, and here's all the pages related to about Globe Bank. Click on back to list. Let's try consumer. Here's the ones related to consumer. Back to list, small business, and so on. You see, you're seeing only pages now that belong to each one. We've nested those pages underneath each one of those subjects. Before we move on, there's one last thing that I want to do, which is that I also want to go back to this pages index.php page where we were listing all the pages. We're not going to need this anymore. We're not ever going to go to our pages from some kind of global view that shows us all of the pages. So we can remove this. In fact, we can remove the entire page. Let's just come down here. And instead, let's just put in a line that says redirect to URL 4, and we're going to redirect to staff index.php. So if you try to go to this page for any reason, it's just going to take us back to the main staff menu page. Why keep this page here? Why not just delete it? Well, it's a good security practice to always have an index.php file in every folder. So it's a good idea to still have it there. It's going to check for the login. That doesn't really matter too much. The main thing is that it's going to redirect if you try to visit this page. It's not going to actually do anything. In the last movie, we were able to nest our pages underneath our subjects. It would be great if that was all there was to it, but unfortunately there's a bit more of housekeeping that we need to do. For example, we need to think about the links that we've created by nesting these files underneath the other ones. The contents of our links may need to be adjusted in order to keep the current site functionality. So if we're looking at our subjects list and we click on a subject, we now see a list of the pages, right? Now all the links related to subject haven't changed, right? If we edit a subject, delete a subject, all that works exactly the same. However, under pages, when we go to view a page, it's going to take us to a page, look at the content of a page. But notice here that I have this link that's back to list. This used to take me back to a page that was staff pages index.php. But that page basically doesn't exist anymore. We made it into just a simple redirect back to the menu. This is not what we want anymore. We want to modify the link for back to list so that it does something different. So inside pages, inside show.php, right here where we have this backlink, we don't want to go to pages index.php anymore. Instead, we want to go to subjects show.php. That's the page that took us here, right? We came from that page. We need to go back. And that page won't work on its own. It also needs an ID to know which subject to show. So let's put a question mark, ID equals, and then period, and we'll concatenate together a value. We want to make sure that we use HTML special chars on that and also our URL encoding. So I'm going to put both of those in there. Now, the value here is going to be the subject ID. You'll notice that down here, I'm actually using page subject ID to find the subject. So it's right here, right? This finds my subject for me. If I take this code and I just cut it, move it up a little higher on the page here, let's actually just clean this up a bit. There we go. Now I'm finding the page, and then right away, I go and find the subject by its ID. And now I have the subject, and therefore right here, inside this, I can just put subject and then use its ID. I have the ID for the subject. I can use it right here just as easily as I could down here where I'm using the subject's menu name. Let's try that out. And let's also change the name of this as well. We had it back to list. Let's call it back to subject page. There it is, back to subject page. Now click on that link and look at that. I went back to the subject page. Click on view for history, back to subject page, takes me back to about Globe Bank. Okay, so that works great for the show page. We also have the same kind of thing happening on the edit page. If I click edit, I have back to list. So let's just grab this link, the backlink, and let's copy it. Let's jump over to edit.php. Let's look down here, and here it is. Now let's just take that old one and replace it with this one. Back to subject page. but the subject ID here I need. So where am I finding that currently? I'm not. At the moment, I've got a drop down that finds all subjects, but I'm not actually finding a single subject, right? Back over here, I was calling find subject by ID, but I'm not doing that on edit.php. Now I could, that would be one solution, is just to go to the database and ask for it, but I don't need to because I already have the page. The page has been found and the page knows its subject ID. So another way we can get this is to just ask this page for its subject ID. That is because it is the child record in the one-to-many relationship. So it has this foreign key. So we can always get this value from two places, either from the parent object, if we have it handy, or we can ask the child object for its foreign key and use it that way. Either one will work. Let's go back and try that out. Let's reload this page. Back to subject page. When I click on it, I'm back on the subject page. Let's do the same thing on delete. So I'll copy that line. Let's open up delete.php and let's do the same thing. We're going to paste this code in. And here we are, page subject ID. And you'll notice that here, unless it's a post request, in which case I just delete the page, we'll come back to that in a moment, I'm going to be finding the page here. So I find the page, I have the page, therefore I have its foreign key. So when we come back, we try it, let's click on delete, back to subject page. Now the link works, it takes me back to the subject page. Okay, so we've handled 3 of those cases. We handled show, edit, and delete. What about new.php? Can we paste that in there as well? Let's go here for our backlink. Let's paste that in. Now wait a minute. We have a new page here. So this page doesn't have a subject ID yet. It hasn't been assigned. And sure enough, if you go back and try it, I click create new page, and you'll see that I'm on a page, but no subject ID is picked yet, right? It could be absolutely anything. So this back to subject page is going to take me to nothing. If I click on it, you'll see I get nothing. So what I want is I need to know what the subject ID is. And it makes sense too that when I'm creating a new page, that I should be telling that new page, hey, by the way, you're coming from this subject page. All right, I should pass along that information, who the parent should be. So what I want to do is, before I get to that page, I actually want to go back to show.php for subjects. And down here where I have that link for new.php, I want to include the subject ID. The subject ID equals, concatenate together, make sure that we escape those values. And what ID do we want to use here? It is going to be subject ID. All right, so now let's go back. We're on the subject page. Let's reload it. When I click on create new page now, it sends the subject ID up in the URL, right? Subject ID equals 1. So now I can come back to new.php and I can read that value in. So right here, if I come in, I don't get a blank subject ID. What it does first is it checks to see if there is a get variable for subject ID. It'll use that. Otherwise, it'll default to, I'm just going to make it 1. So it'll default to 1 by default. All right, now let's try it. Just so we don't have 1, let's go back to our list of subjects and let's go to consumer. Let's click on view. So this is ID 2. Let's click on create new page. Subject ID equals 2. And look at that. Consumer is already pre-selected in this list for us. And now when we click back to subject page, it knows that we came from consumer because I have that ID. So the key thing that you need to remember about these nested links is making sure that you can pass around the information you need to maintain your nested state so that you know what the parent record is. Sometimes you may be able to get that from the parent itself. Sometimes you can get it from the foreign key of the child object. Sometimes you need to pass it in the URL so that you know it. There's actually a fourth possibility as well, which is that if we go to submit our form for our new page, we still have the subject ID, and that's because it's in the form data. It's passed in the form data. So when we call URL4, we're not passing in the subject ID there. It's actually down here in the form data, and that allows us to be able to use it up here inside the form processing. We'll talk more about the form processing and specifically the redirects in the next movie. In the previous movie, we learned how we had to adjust some of our links so that they would work with our new nested resources. Now in this movie, I want us to talk about our redirects and how we need to modify our redirects to take account of the nesting. In our application, there are really 3 places that we make use of URLs. The first is in our links. That's the most obvious one. We worked with that in the last movie. The second is when we have form actions, because the form action submits, it's not quite the same as a link, but we also need to take into account what URLs we're using there. And then the third one is our redirects. Whenever we have a redirect, we need to take into account to make sure that this still works with our new nested structure. Here I am on new.php, and you can see that once I've created a new page, I've got it returning back to staff pages show.php. So it's going to go back to the same page that I have already when I click on view for a subject, right? That's fine. There's no problem with that. That page is already fixed so that it works with our nesting. So it's okay to redirect to that page. I did the same thing for my edit page. The edit page, after it's done with its form processing, also goes to pages show.php. Those are choices I made. They didn't have to redirect to that page. They could have redirected somewhere else. So I should always take a look at them to make sure. My show page doesn't have any redirects, but my delete page does. And this is one that does require some additional attention. Because while we did have a subject ID here that we could use for our link, when we do the redirect, it's a little bit different. When we get our form, we submit the form to delete.php with an ID. So we have the page ID being sent in. That then comes up here where we get the ID. So now we have the ID of the page we want to delete. We check and see it's a post request. We take that ID and we immediately delete the page. We don't go find the page, so we don't know its foreign key. And we don't go find its parent, the subject. So we don't have, right now, any good way to know what this subject ID is so that we can redirect back to it. Because right now, you'll see it's redirecting back to that pagesindex.php. And that makes sense. Before, if we deleted a page, we couldn't exactly go to its show page afterwards, right? Couldn't go to show.php. We went back to the list of all the other pages that were there. So this won't work for us anymore. This now needs to go back to the subject's show page, the parent subject, whenever we delete a page. So you delete a page, you go back and you see the subject, which shows all of the sibling pages that are not yet deleted. But to use this show page, we also need to be able to provide an ID. So this redirect needs to have an ID here. We know we're going to need to escape those values. So how do we get a value here? What can we put in to know what this is? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we can do it. The first is that down here, while we know the subject ID, right? We have the foreign key, we found the page. We do that whenever it's a GET request, we find the page. Down here, we could include the subject ID in the URL here. Then we would have it as part of the URL when the form action submits. Or we could put it in the form data. We could have a hidden field, for example, in here that would send it as form data. And then we could get it out of the post data instead of the get data. Or the other possibility is that we just simply move this code up here that finds the page up higher. Right now it only executes when it's not a GET request, but we could make it so that it actually happens all the time. And that's the one I'm going to do. I'm going to make this additional request to the database so that we find the page and then we turn around and we delete the page. The main reason to find the page is so that right here we can have find page by its foreign key, and that'll be our subject ID. Now we can redirect to it because we now have that data. We've pulled it out of the database here, even though we turned right around and deleted that same record right afterwards. Why did I choose this one? Well, I think it's a little cleaner. I think it's a little nicer not to have it in the URL just for this one case or to populate my form data. There's no reason to have form data that just sends along a foreign key. And I also can think of cases where I might want to check and see if this page exists, right? Go to the database, see if the page exists. If it doesn't exist, then don't try and delete it, right? Do something different instead. Redirect back to another page saying, hey, sorry, the page you just wanted to delete doesn't exist, right? So I can think of a lot of ways that I could provide better error checking if I first go and look for the page before I try and delete it. So that's why I picked this one. So we'll save the result. So now we've counted for all of our links, all of our forms, and all of our redirects. They all work now with our new nested structure. In this movie, we're going to learn to add a page count to each one of our subjects. We already learned how to count records in a result set before. We had find pages by subject ID to get a page set back, and then we called MySQL num rows on that page set, and it'll tell us how many rows there are. That'll give us our page count, so we know how many there are, and then we can free up the result. We now have a count that we can use. We're already doing this type of counting on our new.php and edit.php pages when we list the form options for position. We only have the number of positions available that we have the number of subjects or pages. Now in that case, it worked well enough. It makes one SQL request and it counts the rows in the result. The database is returning a lot of extra data for each row that we're then discarding, but that inefficiency won't really even be noticeable. However, what if we want to count the pages for each one of these subjects? Suddenly now we're doing 4 times the work, and we're making 4 times the SQL requests, and the efficiency starts to matter. What if instead we had 20 subjects? Then we'd be doing 20 times the SQL requests and have 20 times the discarded data. That starts to matter a lot. Instead of doing it that way, we're going to learn a different technique which is more efficient, and that's to use SQL's count. In order to get this rolling, to start with, let's go into our project and let's go to subjectsindex.php, and right after name, let's add in a new column which is going to be pages, and then down here, let's add in a TD, and what we want to put in here is the page count. That's what we're going to put inside this table cell, is the page count. We can actually reload the page so you can just see it, right? It's going to be right here. It's going to tell us how many pages there are for each one of these subjects. In order to do that, we're going to write a new function. We're going to go into query functions, and let's scroll down query functions for a ways until we get to find pages by subject ID. Now we know we could use find pages by subject ID, get back all of the pages, and then call the function MySQL num rows. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to modify this to just do the counting for us inside the function. So I'm going to copy all of that function and paste it in here. And instead of find pages by subject ID, I'm going to call it count pages by subject ID. Right? It's going to work pretty much the same way, except instead of finding them, it's just going to return a single count to us. We'll keep all the options for visibility and everything there. That's fine. And then down here inside our code, the change that we need to make is that in our SQL code, instead of select all from pages, we need to just put right here in front of this asterisk, count, and then put parentheses around it. What this does is tells MySQL, hey, go find these records, but don't return the data to me. Count them. Tell me how many there are. Now you can have count all like that, that's fine. Or you can just say count ID, right? How many IDs are there? Just go and bring back the ID. Tell me how many IDs you find as a result. Either one will work. I'm just going to work with the ID only. Now, I don't really need order by position. It doesn't hurt anything. But I could go ahead and just take that line out so that it isn't, an issue here. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it in. Now, you'll see that I'm calling the MySQL query, and I'm getting back the result. I don't want to just return a full result set here because I'm not working with a set of pages anymore. I just need to get a single count. So I'm actually going to skip down here, and instead of the result, I'm going to return count. So what we need to do is figure out what that count is. So there are a couple of ways we can do this. The first is we can have count equals, and we can call MySQL fetch underscore row. Now we talked about this very early on, but we haven't been using it. We've been using MySQL fetch a sock, right? Let's scroll down here, and you'll see we were using MySQL fetch a sock instead. That returns an associative array that returns an associative array results back. If we use MySQL fetch row, it doesn't return a associative array, it just turns at a single array, just an array of the results. In fact, let's just make this more clear by actually making this be row. So it's going to return a row here to us. And then before we forget, let's go ahead and just free up that result because we also aren't going to need that anymore, and that's a good practice. MySQL free result. Let's free up that result. Okay, so now we have a row of data. In order to get the count for that, the count is going to be equal to the first item in the row because there's only one item being returned, the count of the ID. So it's a row that has a single element in it, but we do need to get that first item using the 0 index because it is still an array. It's basically returning an array to us that has one and only one thing in it. This gets the count and returns it back to us. Let's try it, see if it works. Let's save it. Count pages by subject ID. Let's switch back over here. And right here, while we're inside the loop, we're looping through each subject. Let's add a line that says page count equals count pages by subject ID. And we're going to pass in the subject, with its ID. And then once we have that value, let's come down here. PHP will echo back that value into that table cell. All right, let's come back and let's try it. Reload the page and look at that. 4 pages in this one, 3 in this one, 3 in this one, 3 in this one. We can click on those to verify. There's 4 in that one. Click on this one, you'll see there's 3 in that one. Now the SQL that it's using here is much more efficient. It's not going back and getting all of the data from those pages. It's saying, hey, MySQL, send me back a number. And that's all it does. It sends back a number, a single number back to us, not lots and lots of data. Now, we are working with MySQL fetch row here. I did want to mention that you also can use an association still. If you want to use an association though, then you need to also add a line up here that just says as count. This will give it a name. And then when you use fetch assoc down here, you'll have a name attached to it. So now I can actually say that the row count is what I want to return back. It works basically the same way. I'll just reload it and you'll see you get the same results. Now, I personally think that there's no reason to do that extra step. So I'm going to leave that out. I'm just going to use MySQL fetch row instead. One more time just to make sure it works. And there we go. This is a much more efficient way to ask MySQL to count records for you. So far in this chapter, we've learned how we can nest our pages underneath our subjects. And in the last movie, we talked about how we can more efficiently count the number of pages that belong to each subject. I now want to take those two ideas and combine them together to talk about how we scope the page position by its subject. You may or may not have noticed that we actually have a problem in our current code. If we go to one of our subjects, we view the pages, and then I click on one of the pages to edit it. If I look at the position listing, you'll see that I have 13 different positions available. Why is that? Well, it's because I have 13 different pages, but that doesn't seem quite right. It seems like instead that I should have positions 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? That it should be scoped by the subject. And then for another subject, such as over here on consumer, I ought to have positions 1, 2, and 3, right? I should never, ever run into a case where I have position number 12 or 13, right? Each one of these is scoped and broken up by its subject. My position listing doesn't do that though, so I need to make those changes. In the last movie, we saw how we could write count pages by subject ID in order to efficiently find the count of pages belonging to a subject. We're going to use that here. So I'm going to copy the name of that function just so we can make use of it. I'm going to go down here to my pages listing, and let's start with new.php. You'll see that the way that we're getting that list of pages is right here. I'm finding all pages right now, and then I'm counting the number of those pages and adding 1, and that's how I'm getting this page count. I want to change that. Instead, I want to come up with the page count by calling find pages by subject ID, and then I want to pass in whatever my subject ID is. So right here is that subject ID. That should be passed in both cases. It'll be passed in when I'm creating a new page and I don't have any data yet, and then it should also be available up here in the post data whenever I've submitted the form. So I'm going to take that page ID, pass it in, and I should get back a count of pages. And then I want to make sure that I call +1 on it because it's a new record. So it's the number of current pages +1 for this new one that I'm creating. So I'm going to just remove all of that old code. Let's save it. Let's come back and let's try it. Let's go back to subject page. Here I have 3. Now when I click create new page, my position has 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? So this could be number 4. That would be the next one. That'd be great. Now that works for creating a new one, but what about for editing one? When I click on edit, you can still see I'm getting a list of 13. So I want to do this same thing. I'm just going to copy this line. Let's go over to edit.php and let's do the same thing. Here I had the page set before. Notice that I'm not adding +1 to it this time. So I want to remove that because I'm going to maintain the current set of pages when I'm editing it. So I'm going to just remove all of that. Now we should have our page count. Let's come back and reload the page. And position now is 1, 2, and 3. Click back to subject page, back to list. Let's go to this one about Globe Bank. We'll view it. Let's edit one of these pages. And sure enough, I have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Back to subject page. If I click create new page, I should have 1 through 5 now. See how that works? So now our code that determines the number of available positions is more efficient and it's scoped by the subject. It's not all pages, it's just pages for a particular subject. Now, I do want to call your attention to one thing here. which is that I can edit a subject. I can change it to be a different subject, right? I can switch the subject that each page belongs to. I can move it to a different parent. That may or may not be a good feature. That's up to you. You may want to be able to move it and move a page to a different subject, no problem. But if you do that, then it's not going to update this position, right? The position is still whatever it was before. It didn't reload and go find out what this new position is. Now you could use Ajax or something like that to go and query the database and find out how many positions are available in small business and update it accordingly. But that's not built into this right now. So just keep that in mind. We could just disable this so that it's not possible to switch positions, or we could add some fancier code that would figure out the position once we switch to a new one. But I just wanted to call your attention to it so that you saw that that was a trade-off that we were making there. Neither one is the right answer. It's really a matter of personal style and your needs. It's time for another challenge assignment. This one is a difficult challenge. It's the hardest one we've had yet, but it doesn't use any skills that you have not learned. It just requires persistence and very careful reasoning. The idea behind the challenge is to automatically manage the position numbering of your subjects and your pages. That means that whenever you add a new subject, move a subject to a different position, or delete it, it should adjust the positions of the other items accordingly. It's going to reduce the item by item editing, because right now, if you want to move a subject from position 1 to position 5, you have to go into all the other positions for the other subjects and adjust them accordingly. That's a real pain. Instead, we're going to add code that's going to automatically adjust those other positions for those other items whenever you perform those functions for insert, update, and delete. Let me walk you through some of the concept of how it works. So let's say that I have a list of subjects. Here I have 5 different subjects. I've added a new one that we don't have in our database called retirement. And let's say that I want to add a 6th one as well. I want to add one called investments. And I'm going to add it at position number 5. Now retirement is currently at position number 5. So in order to make room for investments, what I need to do is add 1 to retirement's position, and then that would make it position 6. And that would make room for investments to then become position number 5. Or if I wanted to remove an item, to delete an item, any items below that item would need to subtract 1 from their position. So for example, if I'm taking investments back out, now it's gone. Now I have items 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I don't have an item 5, and I do have an item 6. So I need to subtract 1 from all items that have a position greater than the one I just deleted so that it closes up that hole where that deleted item was. There's also the case when we want to move an item from a starting position to later in the list. That is, the starting position is less than the ending position. When we do this, we want to subtract 1 from all items where the position is greater than the start position and less than or equal to the ending position. So let's say that I'm going to move consumer from the 2nd position, and I'm going to move it down below investments. So small business, commercial, and investments all need to slide up. They all need to have 1 subtracted from their position, and then that'll make room for consumer to go in at position 5. Or we can do the reverse of this. When we have an item where the starting position is greater than the ending position, in other words, we want to move it up higher in the list, then we need to add 1 to all the items that are going to have to shift. So here, if I'm moving consumer, small business, and commercial down, they would all add 1, and that makes room for investments to go into its spot at number 2. So we'll always be working with the starting position and ending position, and we're automatically going to update the positions of the items that are between them. There are 4 cases for your code to consider. There's adding a new item to the list, deleting an item from the list, moving an item to a later position in the list, or moving an item earlier in the list. You've seen examples of each one of these, and you can certainly go back and review those if you need to. But let's walk through the specifics of each one together. When we want to add a new item, it means that our starting position is 0. There is no starting position. So we can just have the starting position be 0, but we know the ending position. We know where we'd like it to end up. There's going to be no existing record for us to consider, so we don't need to worry about that. But we're going to need to add 1 to all items that are greater than the ending position. If you think about that, it makes sense. You take the ending position we want, anything that comes below that in the list is going to have to shift down. Anything at that position or later is going to shift down, so we're going to add 1 to it. When we delete an item, it's going to be the opposite. we have a starting position now, the position currently. The ending position is 0. We want to remove it from the list. We do have an existing record we want to make sure we exclude from the update. There's no sense in updating the record that we're about to delete. In order to close the hole left when we pull that item out, all items that are further down the list, items that have a greater position number, are going to subtract 1. And then there's the possibility when we move an item from earlier in the list to later in the list. We have both a starting and ending position. We have an existing record we don't want to have in our update. The important part of it, though, is that we want to subtract 1 from all items that are greater than where it is now, all the way up to and including the ending position where it's going to end up, right? We're just going to shift all those items upward and then be able to slide our item in at the bottom of that section. And then the other possibility is moving an item earlier in the list. Again, we have a starting and ending position and a record to exclude. It's going to add 1 to all items greater than or equal to the ending position and less than the starting position. Again, the code to accomplish this isn't that hard. It's just making sure that you have solid reasoning behind it. I want to give you just a basic skeleton that you can use to get started. I've got a function here called shift subject positions. We'll pass in a starting position and an ending position and a current ID if there is one. That'll tell us the current record. Then you can see I've got a bunch of conditions. The first condition is when starting position is 0. That's a new item. Or the ending position is 0. Then it's an item being deleted. Or there's the case when the starting position is less than the ending position, or when the starting position is greater than the ending position. In each of these cases, you would write different SQL that you could perform. I also want to give you a sample of what that SQL might look like to help you out. Here's an update statement. I'm updating subjects, and I just want you to see that I'm setting the position equal to position -1. It's perfectly valid to do this in MySQL, just to simply say, I don't care what your current position is, just subtract 1 from whatever that value is. You can do that. So if we have a where clause that's finding positions that are 3, 4, 5, and 6, then this would set all of those to just 1 less. They would become 2, 3, 4, and 5. It would also exclude the current ID, which in this case is ID 8, so that wouldn't be included in this update. So you'll want to complete that shift subject positions function with the correct SQL updates, and then call it with the correct values from inside your insert subject, update subject, and delete subject functions so that it happens automatically. My advice is to start by getting this working with your subjects. And once you've got that working, then move on to tackle the pages, because the pages are going to work the exact same way, except the pages must also consider the subject ID. Remember, the positions now, we have them scoped by the subject ID. So it's not all positions that we want to take into account. We want to always limit it to just the pages that belong to the same subject ID that we're working with. Spend some time working with it. See if you can get it. Remember, if you get stuck and you mess up your positions, you can always log into MySQL directly to edit those values back to something sensible again, and then work on your code a bit more. In the next movie, I'll show you the solution that I came up with. It's time for me to show you the solution that I came up with for automatically updating the positions of our subjects and our pages. Hopefully, you got a solution working yourself. But if not, don't get discouraged. The first thing I want to do was write this shift subject positions function. So I've got a starting position, an ending position, and then a current ID. And I defaulted that to 0. That's because my SQL statement has and ID not equal to 0, then it'll just do nothing because there are no items that have an ID of 0. So it's a good default to have. So I'm going to include my database so that I have access to that later. And then I'm going to have a little line here that says if the starting position and the ending position are equal to each other, well then don't do anything. Nothing changed, right? So just return. And that's a nice little fail-safe there that just bails out. If that's not true though, then we do need to make some updates. So the SQL in every case is going to update the subjects table. So I go ahead and put that at the beginning. And then I've got my conditionals. If the starting position is equal to 0, it's a new item and we need to add 1 to all items greater than the ending position. So set position equal to position plus 1, where position is greater than or equal to the ending position. And I'm just using DB escape around that value to make sure that it's safe for SQL. Then there's the possibility that the ending position is equal to 0. That would mean that I'm deleting an item. So I want to subtract 1 from items greater than the starting position. So once again, set position equal to position minus 1, where position is greater than the starting position. And then there's a possibility that I'm going from the starting position that's less than the ending position. In other words, I'm going from higher up on the list to further down on the list. So I'm moving it later. I need to subtract one from the items between them and including the ending position. So position equals position minus 1, where position is greater than the starting position, or position is less than or equal to the ending position. And then I've got starting position greater than ending position, meaning I'm moving it earlier in the list. Then I want to add one to all the items between them and also including the ending position. So now I have position equals position plus 1, where position is greater than or equal to the ending position and position is less than the starting position. So I've built up all that conditional SQL depending on the case. And then in every case, I'm going to exclude the current ID. Again, because that could be 0 if I don't send it, it'll just basically do nothing. Otherwise, if I do have a meaningful current ID, then it'll make sure that's not included in this. It'll be looking at the other items, not the one that I'm currently working with. Then I just call MySQL query on it, get back my result. The result for an update statement is true or false, so it just returns true back or handles the error if there was a problem. That's very similar to what we were doing when we did other kinds of update statements. The difference here really is that we're updating a whole lot of records at once. We're not just updating one record like we did when we were working with CRUD, we're updating a series of records. Okay, so once I had written that, then I needed to install it and start using it. So let's first go up here to a new record, insert subject. I still want to perform my validations, but if it passes validations, before I actually insert the subject in the database, let's make room for it. So I call shift subject positions. Its starting position is 0. Its ending position is the position that's in the form data, the one I just validated. And I don't have a current ID, so I'll leave that blank. Next, update subject. This time, I need to provide the starting position, and I don't know what the old starting position was, right? That's the position that was in before, and that's not anywhere in this subject associative array. This array has the new position I want. So I've actually got to make another trip back to the database here to check it out. All right, it might be something that tripped you up, but you have to go back to the database to find out what that old position was. That gives me the old subject. I'm calling it old subject just to keep it separate from this new subject that I'm working with here. I have old subject, I get its position and set that to old position. Now the starting position is old position. The new one is the one that's in the associative array, and the current ID is the ID that's in that associative array. And then when we go to delete the subject. Now, when we delete a subject, we have to be careful because we're not passing in an associative array here, right? This is not subject. We're just passing in an ID. So I can use that ID to go find the subject and get the old subject and get the old position, same as before. Now, when I call shift subject positions, I've got my old position. The new position is 0 because I'm removing it from the list. So the new position is 0, and then the current ID is ID. Not subject ID like it was when we were working with update. So don't let that trip you up either. And that's it. Let's try it out before we look at pages. We'll go into Firefox. Let's go to subjects and let's create a new subject. And I'm going to call this junk subject. And I'm going to put it in at spot number 2. Create subject. Okay, created it fine. I'll click back to list. And here it is, junk subject at position number 2. And notice all the other positions shifted down accordingly, 1, 3, 4, and 5. Now let's move position number 2. Let's just move it down to 4. Edit subject, back to list. Now junk subject is down here at 4. And you can see the other ones shifted up accordingly, right? Items 2 and 3 moved up. They subtracted 1 so that they could fill in that gap of where it used to be and also make room for where it needed to go down here. And then finally, let's click delete on jump subject, and you'll see that it deleted and commercial came up and became 4 to fill that gap. It subtracted 1. The process of working with the pages is exactly the same. In fact, you can just take all that code and just paste it. That's what I did. Called it shift page positions, but I have one additional argument, and I chose to put this argument before current ID. That was a design choice. You could do it different ways, but I decided to put it before there, even though it makes it a little bit not symmetrical to the other one, right? Because this one has to have 3 arguments before the optional argument. Passing in that subject ID, though, is critical because in this code, everything else here is exactly the same, but I've got an additional line right down here that says I'm also including in my where clause a clause for the subject ID being equal to that subject ID. So It's where the position meets these criteria and the ID is not the current ID and the subject ID, the foreign key or the parent, is the same, right? So we're only dealing with ones that are under this subject, not all pages, just this subject's pages. Everything else that's in here is exactly the same, except that I also changed the name of the table, of course, to update pages instead of update subjects. So once I had that written, then I went up to my insert, and right after my validations, I call shift page positions. It goes from 0, it's not in the list, to the position that it should be in, and I include the subject ID. That should be in this associative array. It should have a subject ID, so I'm going to include it here. And then, of course, there is no current ID to include after that. Then when we go to update page, I also still have to go and find the old page, just like before. So I get an old position, I have the current position, and I have that page's subject ID to use to scope it with, as well as the current ID. And then for delete, when I go to delete the page, it's a good thing that I'm finding that page because since I only have the ID here, I need to look at this old page in order to get both the old position and also so that I can get its subject ID, right? That's the only way I would know what this foreign key was, is to go look up that record in the database, and then I would know what scope we were dealing with. So it's important that I do that there. And that's it. Let's try this out to see how that works. I'll go back into Firefox. Let's go to small business. We'll view it. Let's create a new page on small business. You see I've got positions 1, 2, and 3. Let's add a new one. This is going to be junk page. We'll put it at position number 2. Content will be this is junk, and I'll create the page. Now I'll go back and look at the subjects. Now you can see here it is, right at position number 2, and 3 and 4 shifted down to make room for it. Let's now edit it. Let's make it position number 3, edit page, back to the subject list, and here it is at item number 3, number 2 shifted up accordingly. And then finally, let's delete that one, delete the page, and it's gone, and you see that item number 4, merchant services, moved back up into position number 3. So now we've got automatic code that makes managing the positions for our subjects and our pages much easier. If you didn't get a workable solution on your own, spend a few minutes reviewing it and go until you do get it, because it really does use all the skills that we've been working on throughout this course. There's nothing here that you shouldn't be able to do. It's just a matter of reasoning through it and being methodical and careful about the logic until you've got something that works.